Pentos, or Pentos if you prefer, that rhymes with Mentos. The nearest free city to King's Landing. It's often embroiled in Westerosi politics as a result. It's the go-to location for exiles, or at least the first stop on their way to a fuller exile. It's arguably surpassed Tyrosh as the new home of Blackfire conspiracies. Connington, Young Griff, the Golden Company, not to mention Dany and Viserys. Tyrion goes through there as an exile. Dany's first chapters are there, of course. It's where her arc starts. As is her marriage to Khal Drogo. We have some thoughts on that, of course. It housed Maegor for a time, then Daemon and Laena, Baela and Rhaena, and all their dragons. The list doesn't stop there. The proximity to Westeros has given us a lot of recent history to play with. But Pentos has a rich ancient history as well, involving Valyria, the Andals, and other lesser-known, perhaps supernatural elements. But just the combination of Valyria and Andalization is really unique. The region around the area is compelling and filled with fun tales and anecdotes, from wars with their neighbors to the pair of Valyrian Sphinxes along the Dragon Road to Goyandro. Which brings us to what some of you will find most compelling of all, how Pentos plays into the story. As the place where Dany's arc begins, you best believe her story is coming back through there. It's a stepping stone away from Westeros, but also the way back to it. To go forward, you must go back is a motto of Dany's arc, and well, it's a bit foreshadowy in this case, I think, too. Events seem to be culminating there, so even without that, we would have thought she'd go back there, but there's a lot of other things happening on there as well, whether it's a reckoning for Illyrio, or the city itself, or maybe the Tattered Prince seizes the city, and maybe the reckoning comes for Pentos before Dany even gets there, and thus it'll be something like a double reckoning. Well, we've got all that and more on this episode of History of Westeros podcast. Hello and welcome, everybody, back for another episode, a heavily seasoned world-building episode, but this one probably more plot-oriented than some of the free cities. We haven't covered all the free cities yet. Braavos is big, Volantis as well, but Pentos is probably got as much to do with the main story as any of them, if not more so. Some of that remains to be seen, of course. We'll talk about all of that today. Sean, how's it going? I know your leg is still really bothering you. We appreciate you being able to do this while being in such pain. Are you drinking anything to help you out there? Any milk of the poppy or milk of the almond or milk of the oat or anything like that?
I had the Naked protein treat, which is kind of creamy, and there's also this V8. V8 has this line of fruit juices. One is pomegranate blueberry. And I mixed those together with the Dr. Pepper. And it was like a float at first. It's a little bit more of this brown, homogenized, still kind of creamy. We'll call it milk of Dr. Pepper.
Milk of pepper.
I can see there's like a purple bit at the bottom, like it's definitely separated, like some weird chemistry experiment there.
Yeah. I've taken some ibuprofen and Tylenol, and I've got, I might wince every now and then, but my mobility's improving. I'm determined to not just get back on my feet, get back dancing.
Yeah, well, we're all pulling for you, every single one of us, I'm sure. Go Sean. Shout out to our good friend Nina, who had a question on her blog that's somewhat relevant, actually quite relevant today. The question is related to parallels between Ned and how he handles Jon Snow versus Illyrio and how he handles Griff. Both have allegedly the child of a loved one in their possession, basically in their care, and handle it very differently. It's both these children have a claim to the throne, to the Iron Throne, but one, well, we're not entirely sure what Illyria is up to, but it seems to be more about ambition, whereas Ned was trying to protect the child. Very, very different approaches. So that's a great observation by Nina, and you're going to want to read it at goodqueenalley.tumblr.com. That's one L in alley, just like Allison. Yeah. And of course, she has a lot of notes in our episode today, as she so often does. Great takes on Pentos and Illyrio and a lot of these other characters that are involved. This episode was voted on by patrons. Next week was not voted on by patrons. It's going to be a scripted episode. It's going to be available for patrons and subscribers only. which you can still get in on our special offer deal to sign up for Patreon at $2 level before it goes away in August.
Worth noting that we had our first Whiplash Hangout session, which is something that you unlock by being a patron. We must have had like 10 people participating. It was a good time. We played some games. We streamed it to the Facebook page. And if you want to join in, well, you have until July 27th, when the next one will be, a Thursday, to sign up.
Yeah. Now you can participate in those without being a patron, but you, as part of the audience participation, we had about an equal number of people there hanging out and voting on the funniest answers, and that's a great time as well.
I played in and won all 3 games of Whiplash, and all of you that weren't there have no way to verify that. So.
Other than Aziz and I laughing at that.
That's not true. I was there.
It's so funny that I would be so braggy about it, because usually I'm so humble.
If the episode ends and you're still wanting to stay in the world created by George R. Martin, we've got you covered with plenty of other episodes that could vault you into similar locations and places. We'll start with our trivia question, as we so often do. The Pentoshi historian / political actor Gezio Heratis wrote a book called Before the Dragons, a title that we've used, that claimed Pentos and another city were actually founded before the Freehold. What other city does Gezio name alongside Pentos as predating Valyria? Yes. The first mention of Pentos, we often like to start with that. Again, I want to know, do you say Pentos or Pentos? It's not as big a pronunciation debate as Celtigar, but I am curious what y'all would say.
I think it's Pentos, and my reasoning is that it would have a second S if it was Pentos. So, assuming normal phonetic rules, which we can't necessarily assume, but that's my
That's
default.
a reasonable argument. Yeah, okay.
I say zebra.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, I say zebra. No, I know I don't, except for...
That's a unique set of phonetic rules there.
I say pantus.
I pronounce it Janowski. Okay, so the first mention comes very early on because it's where we meet Dany in her first chapter, along with Viserys, Khal Drogo, and Illyrio, who is the only one of those who's actually from Pentos.
A gift from the Magister Illyrio.
Viserys said, smiling. Her brother was in a high mood tonight.
The color will bring out the violet in your eyes, and you shall have gold as well, and jewels of all sorts. Illyrio has promised. Tonight, you must look like a princess.
A princess, Dany thought. She had forgotten what that was like. Perhaps she had never really known. Why does he give us so much, she asked. What does he want from us? For nigh on half a year, they had lived in the Magister's house, eaten his food, pampered by his servants. Dany was 13, old enough to know that such gifts seldom come without their price, here in the free city of Pentos.
Viserys, older than 13, was not old enough to know that such gifts seldom come without their price. Dany, it's immediate right away how much smarter Dany is than Viserys. So it's a great quote showing that she's way ahead in terms of just the way of the world, intuition, human nature, lots of other things too. It's also a great sort of pun that Nina points out. It's the first example of a quote-unquote free city with nothing is given for free here, as we're just told. Like, that doesn't even get into our recurring discussion on slavery in the free cities, which is a little different here in Pentos. In some ways, it's very much the same, but in some ways it's not. So we'll get into that. So this is very close to coming all the way back around again, as I said in the intro. Dany's arc is returning her to Pentos, and there may be a reckoning of sorts. So more to come on that as we work our way through the timeline.
I want to make a little observation here. I think that some of Dany's awareness versus Viserys's is not, not that she isn't smarter than him, but I think it's at least as much that he's more self-absorbed than she is, and maybe a little more single-minded. He has this sort of mission, get back to the throne, right? And he's very, full of himself, if you will, where she doesn't have a mission. She's just kind of going along, and she doesn't have the same sort of arrogance he has. So she's absorbing more different things rather than just what he wants and needs, you know? And I think that you might see elements of this throughout her course, right? That she has this idea of getting back to her home and her Iron Throne, but she's more aware of the other problems in these cities, the slavery. She's not quite as single-minded about this one. Worse, I think that
will you re-say that,
it
Sean?
gives her,
She's
for
not
better
so
or worse,
single-minded. Start from there.
She's not so, since she's not so single-minded, she has more different things to be concerned about: slavery, injustice of these different cities, and it, for better or worse, is, if she can stay that way, I think might keep her from. It might keep her on this mission of righteousness, but might keep her from getting to the Iron Throne,
Sure.
Which isn't necessarily the best thing in the first place. I don't know. We'll see. But
yeah. Also, something that caught my attention that might be worth some thought. This second to last mention of Pentos in the entire series. Here we go.
Supper was for language lessons. The blind girl understood Bravosi and could speak it passably. She had even lost most of her barbaric accent, but the kindly man was not content. He was insisting that she improve her High Valyrian and learn the tongues of Lys and Pentos, too.
This could simply be part of her education. This is Arya, of course, we're talking about, as you could probably tell by the blind girl. Learn lots of languages. But it's interesting that Pentos is mentioned specifically. I may be reading too much into it, but I wonder what's that about. Maybe they have plans for her to go there, or if it's just part of her education, like I said. But the fact that it's mentioned specifically is curious. Of course, learning High Valyrian and it leads to the other languages. Pentos and Lyseni, those are just offshoots, bastardized dialects, you could say, of High Valyrian, I think.
You could say maybe High Valyrian is like Latin. Pentos might be Italian.
Okay, sure.
Bravos
Yeah.
might be French or whatever. But
maybe even a little closer. But yeah, that's a great parallel. I like that. I don't think we mentioned this in Lys, because Lys is also, like, Pentos is close to Bravos, so that you can almost see that makes more sense. Lys is a lot farther away, so I'm not sure, but maybe, yeah, it could be just a clue about where the Faceless Men have their attention, or something about their future. Anyway, one of the reasons it's interesting, too, is it reminds us that Pentos has their own language. That's a nice reminder. And Lysene, if we continue this comparison, it's more Valyrian because it's more Valyrian. Like, the city of Lys has deeper origins with Valyria. Now, they were both ruled by Valyria, but Pentos was mingled a lot with the locals, who were mostly Andals and other races that have now been forgotten. And it wasn't founded by the elite. It was founded more by middle-class folks as a trading colony. So they don't care as much about the highborn blood, or there just isn't as much there to be cared about. And that's really relevant for a lot of reasons that will come up throughout this episode. Basically, all the dialects of High Valyrian can be lumped into a category called Bastard Valyrian, which, yeah, kind of like what Sean was saying with the Romance languages.
Bastard Latin.
Bastard Latin, yeah. Nina writes, given that there's been plenty of interaction between Bravos and Pentos in the last few centuries, it's also possible the kindly man expected Arya to run into more Pentoshi words or speakers because of that. Either because more Pentoshi would be expected to be in Bravos for regular diplomatic missions or trade, or for a variety of reasons. Just proximity gives you all sorts of reasons to mingle. Tyrion also observes that Aegon, while still disguised as young Griff, is, quote, fluent in High Valyrian and the low dialects of Pentos, Tyrosh, Myr, and Lys, and the trade talk of sailors. Not to mention taking for him that we see on page lessons in Volantene and Myronese. We have that funny anecdote where Tyrion's like, you need a B up your nose to properly pronounce Giscari words, which Griff laughs at. I like that. Let's talk geography for a minute. Shay's got a few maps to put up on screen here.
I sure do.
Pentos is not quite the farthest west of the Free Cities, even though it's the closest to King's Landing. That would be Tyrosh, which is the closest to the landfall on Westeros. It's very close to, Tyrosh is, to the Stormlands and the Stepstones and Dorne. But you could draw a straight line from Bravos almost all the way straight down to Lys, passing through Pentos. Shea has drawn almost a peace sign there. You've got a little she drew a little pyramid to show how close the connection of Pentos, Mir, and Tyrosh is, and the straight line to show what I was talking about with it's basically just down the coast, just inland a little bit. Yes, almost exactly a straight line from Braavos all the way down to Lys, passing through Pentos. It's pretty cool. So this goes to show and sets up the proximity here, basically describes the start of the geopolitical situation that has existed for thousands of years, although Braavos is not thousands of years old, so the situation would have been different in ancient times. But as it is now, these cities are often competing over the same things. There's been endless fights over the stepstones, over trade routes, over different things here and there. And it's created some really good stories. Volantis would be the furthest away physically, but it's not the shortest, or not the farthest by travel time, because according to several things within the story, it's quicker to go by ship. You can get to Volantis quicker by ship. So that says to me the farthest actual travel time would be to Qohor, which you can't take ship to get there, at least not right away. You have to walk all the way there. Remember, Dany walks that way with Drogo and the Khalasar. They pass all the way through all that, through the forest of Qohor on their way to Vaes Dothrak, which is really, really far away. And there are Valyrian roads. There's a Valyrian road that heads west, or east rather, east out of Pentos towards what used to be the cities of the Rhoyne, and perhaps some other locations as well. And that's, of course, important because they're a trade city. They were founded as a trade city. The Valyrian roads wouldn't have been there right away. The trading by ship would have been their main deal at first, but, of course, they want to do a lot of trading by land as well. It has a sheltered harbor. You can see like a bay in there with like a small inlet. That's a perfect spot. It's ideal. Storms wouldn't hit it as hard because the ocean wouldn't be able to rip up the shore as much, because a lot of that force would be wasted on the outer banks there, and the inner bay would have less turbulence and less storm winds, less waves, all that stuff. Less danger, in other words. By the same token, it's hard to assault Pentos from the sea because they only have to defend that little narrow opening into the bay, which means you could use a smaller navy that could fight a larger navy without fear of encirclement. But despite that, currently, it's considered the most vulnerable of the free cities due to a treaty with Braavos that we'll discuss later. So keep that in mind, because the vulnerability of Pentos absolutely is a feature for the story to come in A Song of Ice and Fire. And that could play out in a number of ways, given we know a lot of people want to take it. Well, it might be relatively easy to take if these clues add up the way we think they do. But
not without consequence.
Yeah, you're right. Not
right. That there's allies, there's money. There's a lot of vested interest in that city. So someone might be able to quickly take it, but they might not keep it, or might not keep their allies if they did it.
Yeah, like the Tattered Prince comes to mind as a candidate for someone that might be able to hold it for the short term, but like he could probably not hold it against the full fury of, say, Daenerys Targaryen, who has not only dragons, but Dothraki and Unsullied. Like, yeah, there's no way he and his Windblown and just the city of Pentos could stop that. They would be more likely to try to, come to an arrangement, which they already wanted to come to an arrangement. They're not stupid. They're not like, yeah, let's take on Dany. Yeah. I mean, they did start off on the other side as her, but they switched. So, yeah. But let's talk about the region around Pentos. It's a really cool area, and Illyrio starts it off.
This is Andalos, my friend, the land your Andals came from. They took it from the hairy men who were here before them, cousins to the hairy men of Ib. The heart of Hugor's ancient realm lies north of us. We are passing through its southern marches. In Pentos, these are called the Flatlands. Farther east stand the Velvet Hills, whence we are bound.
So the kingdom of Hugor, aka Andalos, once overlapped a portion of what Pentos rules now. A large portion, it seems. It's now called the Flatlands, as it says, and that is pretty descriptive. It's a very flat area, very fertile. Lots of orchards and farms responsible for feeding much of Pentos. There's also mines. We know that because Illyrio has some. So it's a great supply of wealth for Dothraki Khals, as well as for the Pentoshi elite, because it's incredibly hard to defend. Like, how are you going to defend the Flatlands against Dothraki? Like, that's their ideal terrain for cavalry. No wonder they come not expecting a fight. They come expecting to get paid, get bribed to go away. And yeah, that's exactly what happens. I mean, that's what Khal Drogo was doing there in the first place, basically. Nina says, this land reminds me a lot of the Westerlands. Perhaps coincidental that we see it best through a Westerman's eyes, Tyrion's. Hills to the east, fertile farmlands in the center, valuable mines in the area, a coast on the west. Yeah, that's all. That is true. That's very similar. Good catch by Nina there. Like I said a minute ago, the Valyrian Road, or one of them, runs from Pentos to Goy and Dro, which is one of the Rhoynar ruins. Both Dany and Tyrion take this route. In ancient times, with or without the Valyrian Road, there'd have been much trade between these two cities. After all, Pentos was founded by traders, and the Goy and Dro would have been one of their closest neighbors. This is like an obvious connection there. They would have been trading back and forth. There probably would have been some just regular road, maybe just a beaten path through the flatlands. It wouldn't have even necessarily needed to be anything special because it's probably pretty easy terrain, which just would increase the amount of trade passing forth between these two places. And the Rhoynar were renowned for their technology, their craftsman stuff. Like the Pentoshi would have been all over that, especially because they would have access to bigger markets. They could go to Goy and Dro, buy stuff, then go back to Pentos and ship it all over the world. The Goyandroni, whatever their name, however you say they're the plural of them, so that for them to reach the world markets, they have to sail all the way south through the entire Rhoyne, which they could do that, but probably easier to just sell it to people that have more access to the world markets. So you got to think that the Pentoshi were not thrilled by the destruction of Goy and Dro, even though they were part of the freehold at the time. Like, hey, we traded with them. That stinks. Dang it.
And you got to remember, trade goes two ways too. There's they would have depended on things from them too. That would have been part of their structure or organization, and supply lines and everything would have been very disruptive to both Pentos and the other people that they're trading with.
Yeah, and not just Goy and Dro. Like, they're the closest of the ruins, but they would have probably been trading with a lot of the Rhoynar cities, especially the ones on the western side of the Rhoyne, but probably all of them, at least indirectly. And there would have been rivalries, though, back between the free cities back before the Doom. The open war is unlikely because they're all just beholden to the freehold, and the freehold probably wouldn't tolerate that. So in some ways, trade may have flowed more freely when they were all rolled up under the freehold, in a manner of speaking, because the freehold was anything but free. But you see my point. Some things would have been a little smoother, whereas now that they're independent, there's occasionally a little more friction between competing powers that be within those cities. Usually that friction is not between the like regular folk, but the elites that stand to gain and lose so much based on certain laws or certain trade deals or what have you. Nina also writes there would have been more trade settlements generally then, or at least different ones that exist now. Yeah. For example, the coming of the Dothraki overran a lot of the smaller towns and fortifications. They just were wiped out, and people just didn't want to live there anymore in the ones that weren't wiped out because they were afraid of what happened to the ones that were wiped out. So more of Essos turned to cities, big walled cities that could afford to buy off the Dothraki or maybe fight them off, like in the case of Qohor that one time. But without the Dothraki, with the freehold ruling the area, there would have been a lot more towns and villages that could have been part of this ginormous trade network that probably used to exist. Now there is still a ginormous trade network, but it's more space between the towns. There's too much risk for a lot of these smaller places to exist. Although there is some evidence that that's starting to return because the Dothraki are not quite as warlike as they used to be, which is really like, well, they're still really, 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 really warlike. But yeah, even they are not quite as bad, partly because of all the technique of bribing them. That didn't exist right away. That wasn't something that just immediately popped up when the Dothraki emerged from the Doom. Northeast of Pentos is the Velvet Hills, which Tyrion called disappointing. He was like, they should be called the Velvet Teats. They're so small. It's kind of like how he makes fun of the Rhoyne at first, like, this river's not that big a deal, and later he's like, oops, okay, I was wrong. So
hadn't seen all of it yet.
Yeah, he hadn't seen all of it. He may have been right about the Velvet Hills, though, but that doesn't mean they're not interesting. They're just not large, and here's a quote that I think makes them sound quite interesting.
They saw a circle of standing stones that Illyrio claimed had been raised by giants, and later a deep lake. Here live a den of robbers who preyed on all who passed this way, Illyrio said. It is said they still dwell beneath the water. Those who fish the lake are pulled under and devoured. The next evening, they came upon a huge Valyrian Sphinx crouched beside the road, It had a dragon's body and a woman's face.
So those sound kind of like stories of the Deep Ones, which pop up all over the world in various stories, or something like them. Actually, in a minute, we'll have a different quote that refers to them as swan maidens, which doesn't sound like Deep Ones at all, although it could be like a cousin species or an enemy of the Deep Ones or something like that. Who knows what great underwater civilizations what's been going on down there all this time? Who knows? But it does.
Who knows about the old Deep One swan maiden rivalry?
Yeah, like what? It's an ancient tale that we don't have any information on. It sounds pretty sweet though. And that reminds us that much of central Essos was once the Great Silver Sea, a giant inland sea which may have been salt water or not, we don't know. A lot of ancient plains in the real world were once seafloors. Like, that's true of the Great Plains in the US. You find sea fossils there, like in the middle of the continent. But that's because similar stuff happened in this setting. Not to mention the Sarnath connection, which literally had Deep One type creatures coming out of the water to attack people. The doom that came to Sarnath being a Lovecraft story and something we talked about in the Kingdom of Sarnor episode, as well as in the Ib episode, I believe. The Ibisode, as is properly referred to. The Sphinx. Now, that we hear in the fuller version of that anecdote, Illyrio says the Dothraki carried the male Sphinx off back to Vastothrak, leaving the female Sphinx behind. That couldn't have been that long ago. I mean, maybe 300-400 years, so a substantial amount of time, but the Sphinx might have sat there for like 1,000 years, 2,000 years, 3,000. I mean, the Great Sphinx in Egypt is thousands of years old, so it's not strange at all to think about something like that. If you get a real world Sphinx that's been there thousands of years, I mean, it's nothing to think about that here in Essos, right?
That one was there for at least 1,001 years.
Yeah, right. So that's kind of neat. Of course, that's very symbolic of the female Sphinx, if that's meant to. It's a dragon Sphinx sitting on a plinth. It's meant to indicate Daenerys. And Tyrion even sees it as a good omen. Dany wasn't carried back to Vastothrak by the symbol of that, but she has been carried back to Vastothrak. At least it looks like she's about to be. And then, well, we'll see what happens next. But, yep, the Dothraki. They're about to be taught a lesson in, feminism, I suppose. To the southeast lie the so-called Golden Fields, an area made fertile by the Rhoyne. This would have been another trade partner long ago, and perhaps an area they'd have tried to move in on after the fall. That'd be one good thing for them. Like, well, we can't trade with Goy and Dro anymore, but we can take their land, the land that they were farming and that we were trading with them. Well, that we can maybe that's our silver lining, is we can own this territory now because there's no one else to claim it, or no one big enough to claim it besides us. So they may have come out ahead of that after all. But since then, there's been lots of warring over these territories. Pentos is surrounded by extremely fertile regions in every direction, including west, because the sea is fertile, and it's, especially for them with their bay, that they probably get quite a lot of fish out of with less risk than a lot of fishermen would take, because, again, it's protected, sheltered from the worst parts of the ocean. But these war areas have since been warred over by the free cities. Especially Braavos has been a problem for Pentos in recent centuries, because Braavos is superior to them militaristically, has gotten the better of it in a number of ways. And that's pushed them back a bit. So Braavos has kind of dominated Pentos somewhat. To the south, they've fought a bit with Myr, and this seems to be more of an even, balanced arrangement. At least not recently, we haven't seen any massive incursions on either side. Certainly not recently, because the Pentoshi military is tiny. So, yeah. Now, referring back to the map briefly, the so-called Golden Fields are almost exactly equidistant between Myr, Norvosh, and Qohor, too. They're in that, like, non-forested area. So, like, you can imagine they would all want the Golden Fields. I mean, it's the Golden Fields. That's like, it just sounds really valuable. And yeah, like all that food. Yeah, there's been fights over that.
So I want to bring something up that I wish it didn't occur to me till just last night, so I didn't get to research it very deeply. But in my mind, I think in George's mind, Pentos is a parallel to Genoa. I think
City of Traders, yeah, right?
Braavos is probably Venice, right?
Sure.
There's some pretty apparent parallels there, and Venice and Genoa were sort of
Rivals.
rival
Yeah.
cities, and there's a lot of parallels that Genoa was like. It's weird to me, in fact, that it's not a better known city. I guess, in modern times it's not as important, but through history it's up there with like Rome and Paris as far as its importance in trade. And one of the first banks ever formed was there. They were the financial backing to the Habsburgs. What's that? To the Habsburgs. They I think they still are the biggest trading port in the Mediterranean. It's hard to fully understand the importance and relevance that city has had over the centuries, but it's never had like a huge, strong army, and it's been taken, annexed, sacked several times. It seems like once or twice a century on average, but keeps bouncing back as this powerful trade entity between its position as a port, its reach, its financial institutions. It's had a lot of powerful influence. And point being, this is all Pentos, right? Almost everything I'm saying lines right up with Pentos.
You're very right. Those are some very strong parallels.
It would have this same sort of meshing of cultures and languages and travel and trade and everything that ethnic background and so on. I know I need to look into it more, but I'm confident there's probably some more detailed parallels that I haven't come up with. But I bet someone out there is an expert on Italy or Genoa could probably fill us in even more.
I'll say Brandon Price in the chat said, "Yay, Genoa recognition." Appreciate that, Sean. So already someone.
Very good. Cool. Thanks for that, Brandon. Let's talk about the founding and people of Pentos. Here's a quote from The World of Ice and Fire.
Pentos is the nearest of the free cities to King's Landing, and trading ships pass back and forth between the two cities on an almost daily basis. Founded by Valyrians as a trading outpost, Pentos soon absorbed the hinterlands surrounding it, from the Velvet Hills and the Little Rhoyne to the sea, including almost the whole of the ancient realm of Andalos, the original homeland of the Andals. The first Pentosi were merchants, traders, seafarers, and farmers, with few of high birth amongst them. Perhaps for this reason, they were less protective of their Valyrian blood and more willing to breed with the original inhabitants of the lands they ruled. As a consequence, there is considerable Andal blood amongst the men of Pentos, making them perhaps our closest cousins.
Yeah, you really don't see this blending of Andal and Valyria anywhere else. I mean, there is some blending of it elsewhere, but this is the hub of that connection. Because the Andals mostly fled the Valyrians. They mostly ran away from them. Like, we can't stop you. We're leaving. They fled to Westeros, very famously, the coming of the Andals, because they couldn't stand against the Valyrian freehold. It was just too powerful. So this is an exception of sorts where it came about because the Valyrians that came to this area that became Pentos weren't coming as conquerors originally. They were coming as traders and set up a trading outpost, and they worked, apparently, from what we're told, worked with the locals and mingled with them and interbred with them rather than conquering it all. Now, there are different takes on this. There is some evidence that there may have been some fighting, but not much evidence. And we hear this one, it's mostly just speculation, so there's a very good chance that it started off relatively peaceably. Sure, there was some cutthroat business stuff back then. I'm sure people were cutting each other out of deals and doing some underhanded stuff to get the most money in certain situations, but they probably weren't starting wars, and the violence would have been kept on a pretty small scale, I think. And of course, we also must remember, as I said about Braavos, it's in this quote, it says they had most of the ancient realm of Andalos at the time. So most of northwestern Essos would have been there. So Pentos in ancient times would have waxed way more powerful. They've since had to dial it back because Braavos rules most of that territory now. And Braavos is just a lot mightier than them for a lot of reasons. As far as the size, now, Astapor is used as a parallel in terms of population size. It's bigger than Astapor, maybe similar in size to, say, Lys or Karth in number of people, but we don't really have great data on that. This is sort of ballparking it. And the people are, of course, called Pentos. What's that?
I don't think George has great data on
Yeah,
that.
right. He hasn't bothered. Yeah.
He's ballparking it.
So they're called Pentoshi now, but they were once a mixture of Andals, Valyrians, slaves from different places would be mingled in the bloodlines as well, and just other peoples. Like I said, I think I mentioned before, there would have been some races that have been long forgotten. Some of which might be supernatural, like the hairy men of Ib, but those were not as likely to be invited to the party, so to speak. It sounds like humans and the hairy men didn't really get along so well, and saw each other as like us or them type scenarios. Like, well, yeah, we got to kill them all, or they're going to kill all of us. So not a lot of agreement or peace between that. So this is different, like we said, from Lys, in that there was the super rich types founding that, whereas this is more middle class folks. And that's almost like Nina says, it's almost the sense in that description that Pentos thrived and dominated somewhat in spite of its origins, or at least without owing much to them. Pentos doesn't seem to have as much connection to the Freehold. It doesn't. There's not a lot of stories of it getting help from the Dragon Lords or this and that. It just seems to have been like, we send you some taxes and get left alone, and that's about it kind of situation. I mean, it was really far from the Freehold too. That's something to keep in mind.
Nina's saying this in reference to that passage we just read,
Yeah.
which is from Yandel, right? The author of the World of Ice and Fire book, right? And so they would have a bias, right?
Yes.
They would want to attribute the success of a great city to royal blood, Valyrians, or not so much to the hard work of the average person, right?
Yes.
Not they wouldn't.
Yes.
Like, somehow these dumb old merchants made a successful city without any royal blood to lead them.
How is it possible? I don't know. Surely because of the great location. Yeah, it couldn't be because of their hard work or anything like that, or their capability. No, just yeah. But the location is important. I mean, we've heard
For sure.
You hear that said about what's the most important thing for a business, or top three most important things for business: location. That's still true even in the era of the internet, because how people find you on the internet is important. Like, you need to be accessible, right? If people can't find you on the internet, it's just as bad as people not being able to find your store in this whatever city you live in, or maybe worse. But still, the same concept applies. So Pentos is just right in the middle of like all the trading of the Narrow Sea. They're in the center of Western Essos, and which lines up with King's Landing there. Whereas Braavos is powerful. They had to scrap their way into that. Braavos is powerful, but kind of remote compared to the other free cities. This is way up in the northwestern corner there, which puts it close to Westeros. But in terms of like getting to like Ashai or even like Volantis, it's pretty far, right? Karth, really far away. For Pentos, it's a lot closer, and they're closer to places that are closer. So they're really in the center of. It's like if this was a giant mall, they'd be in like the prime spot, whatever that is for a mall. I don't know.
I still want to give credit to the value of trade and merchants and hard work of average people, because there are other key spots in good locations too.
Yeah,
that didn't grow to these thriving cities. Like King's Landing only relatively recently became a significant city. And it's very, very similar as far as the positioning.
You're right.
Right?
Yeah,
to
you're totally
Pentos.
right. Like it's no surprise King's Landing thrived because of its right location. Yet why was there nothing there before? Well, probably because of Duskendale and Driftmark and other places that would have stopped them. We're like, no, this is our trade network. We don't want you to get going.
Yeah.
You know, which would have maybe happened in ancient Essos as well. There may have been lots of other Pentos-like places that just didn't make it. Either because
the leaders were more motivated by maintaining their power or their prestige or warring against neighbor, rather than productivity and trade and commerce and exchange of ideas and everything else.
And
so when you get a city of people doing that, they thrive more so than cities who are just trying to be the big dog or whatever.
Yeah. Now, not to say that the elite don't have a lot of power in Pentos, because they do, but it is different. You're right. There are interesting differences in how absolute power, or the highest level of power, is exercised. And it's almost a bit of an in-joke, the way they do it. We'll get to that pretty shortly here. But here's another story. Well, actually, here's a quick one-line quote. Whereas Lorath, Noravos, and Qohor were founded for religious reasons, the interests of Lys, Tyrosh, and Myr have always been mercantile. Interestingly, Pentos, Volantis, and Braavos are not included in that. So, which is peculiar. It's not too peculiar that Braavos is not in there, because they were obviously founded for neither reason. They weren't founded for religious or mercantile reasons. They were founded as a haven for escaped slaves, a place, basically a refugee place that turned into a powerful city over time. It had religious and mercantile and refugee political reasons. It had all that. Volantis was more of an extension of the freehold at first because it's just right there, out, just basically right off of the peninsula, and still has its ancient ties there. So it's different too. So I wonder why Pentos isn't included, because their interests have always been mercantile as well. So I wonder why that's not included here.
An implication that there's also been a religious influence,
Maybe, yeah.
at least, or maybe some other factor. By the way, worth noting, Genoa is the birthplace of multiple popes. Many popes came from Genoa.
Many
so
a
another
pope.
potential parallel there.
Right on. Yeah, that's true. Here's another story, an alternate version of the story of Pentos that maybe helps explain where that quote is coming from. Maybe.
It is claimed in some histories that Pentos and Lorath were of a third type, cities already extant before the Valyrians came, whose rulers paid homage to Valyria and thus retained their right to native rule. In these cities, what influx of Valyrian blood there was came from migrants from the freehold or political marriages used to better bind these cities to Valyria. Yet, most of the histories that recount this take as their source, Gesio Herodes's Before the Dragons. Herodes was himself from Pentos, and at the time, Volantis was threatening to restore the Valyrian Empire under its control. So the notion of an independent Pentos with origins distinct from Valyria was a most politic convenience.
Yeah, that's a super interesting anecdote. Like, this guy's maybe trying to argue that actually Pentos was originally an independent thing, but then it joined the freehold. Now, I don't know how politic this really is, because they didn't need any additional arguments to be free. The doom had happened. Like, there's no Volantis. I mean, there's no freehold to be a part of anymore. So I don't know why they needed arguments for independence when the governing body just vanished into thin air anyway. So it might actually, so maybe this shouldn't be looked at as just a story for political convenience. Maybe it's just a story that was not popular in the freehold because it argues that it wasn't founded by the freehold. So maybe now the truth can come out now that the freehold isn't controlling the narrative. So there's a couple different ways to look at this that goes beyond what's presented, to read between the lines. And I think that's interesting. Nina says, I would believe to some extent that there was a settlement, if not a full city, in the modern location of Pentos, precisely because it is such an attractive geographical area. Absolutely, like we just said. But again, King's Landing, same deal, but didn't have that. King's Landing, there were people in the site of King's Landing, though, to be clear. They just a few hovels, some fishing boats. It wasn't a city. So maybe that's what you could say. Well, yeah, there were people there, but it was just a few people, maybe like a couple dozen. Would you really call that a city? Would you they founded a city there? Yes, there were people there, but those people didn't found a city. They just built some houses. So some of that's kind of semantics, I guess. Like, at what point does it become a city or a town or a village? Or when is it official? When does it get recognized on the map? Maybe Valyria officially gave it a town charter and said, this is officially a real place with authorized governing body, and that's the way they market the founding. These things you can't really pinpoint. You have to...
The ability to levy its own taxes,
to have
its own autonomy when it comes to collecting taxes might be an indication. And there's probably a lot of gray area. I can imagine there were some people who thought of themselves as part of a city already, and some outside entity was trying to tax them, and that outside entity took credit for controlling that city, but maybe multiple different outside entities were doing that, or internal entities were doing that, and maybe at some point it became clear, but probably also still under debate, even if some people thought it was clear.
A reason it may have been more political is that these certain reigns of power or key properties or things of value within Pentos may have been claimed by Valyrians, people of Valyrian origin, because of their heritage. Like, we have first right. We're noble blood from the freehold. And some people are like, nah, actually, this city predates all that, so your claims are invalid. It might be that I could see being a way to push aside
Yeah,
claims of Valyrian freeholders who aren't like backed by dragons, because if they
And
have
it-
dragons, you're not going to stop them. But
Right. It's hard to say that to those people when they have dragons.
Yeah.
But when some of the dragons are gone, then the people are like, okay, now this is back to being mine. This was supposed to be mine in the
Mhm.
first place. Only because I couldn't stop dragons did I not fight for it.
Exactly, and they have all this money, so they're like, well, the Valyrians have a lot of money, so do we. We can win this. You know, they would be a lot more optimistic about staying independent in a post-draconic world. Right? We're like, well, there's no dragons anymore. What are we worried about? Like, yeah, there's not even a continent. There's not even a subcontinent of Valyria anymore. Like, they probably hadn't thought of the Dothraki yet at that point as a problem. But hey, that's a different problem. And Nina says, yeah, this sort of foundational myth making is a big part of the real world too. Like the Romans were big on claiming their ancestors were the Trojans and linking that to Romulus and Remus and all that. It gave them, gave their origin story a lot more potence and a lot more something to unite them all. Like shared heritage is a great way to build community. Within a city or within a town, you can all be kind of proud of the town's origin or what it produces or the quality of its people or just something. People are proud of Bravos. There's probably plenty of people in Pentos that are proud of their city. I would argue the Bravosi probably have more to be proud of, but that's just my preference. What's odd about this, though, is that usually if we use the Trojan War, Romulus Remus stuff, this is kind of the opposite of that, where the Romans were like, yeah, we're connected to the Trojans. These guys, this Jezio Horatius guy is like, we're not connected to Valyria. Like he's doing the opposite. He's like trying to distance himself and instead trying to connect to their own local heritage. So they are still trying to connect this foundational myth stuff, but while also separating themselves from a different myth cycle. So that's kind of interesting. Illyrio has that forked yellow beard that's very oily, that's shiny, and he rubs it in a way that Tyrion finds kind of lewd. He's blue-eyed and blonde himself and is, Pentoshi. So that's kind of maybe a fusion of the Andal and Valyrian look, maybe. Like the Andals are blue-eyed, blonde-haired, and the Valyrians, of course, they have the silver hair and purple eyes, or various colored eyes. They're not all purple. So you kind of, I don't know, that's maybe a clue to Pentoshi beauty standards. Like Illyrio definitely has a type. He was almost into Dany himself and thought the better. Remember what he thinks? Says he's like, oh, I thought she was too timid. Like, okay, you misread her. And then Sarah, he's into Sarah, who was maybe Sarah Blackfire. Sarah's also blonde and blue-eyed, and so yeah, Illyrio has a type, and it's his own type because he was also blonde hair and blue-eyed. Remember that statue made of him that. Maybe that's also a clue to Pentoshi beauty standards. Him maybe the ideal look for a young Pentoshi Bravo. Remember, that's what he was. He was earned a living with his sword at first. The statue was made by someone named Pytho Malanon, which I don't know if Pytho is Pentoshi himself, but every Pentoshi name that I've come across ends in an O. So maybe Pytho, definitely Illyrio, Jezio, Grolio, Nevio, Rego, and Yallo. Remember, Yallo is Tyrion's Pentoshi pseudonym.
Do we know any Pentoshi women, and do their names end in A?
Not a single one.
I didn't think we did. Yeah, I didn't think we did. I would guess that we would see a prevalence of A-ending names.
That's a great call, actually, because you see that in like Romance languages.
Yeah,
right? That's a really good call.
I was gonna say these names all sound like Genoans.
Yeah, they're all, it's all very
Yes,
Italian.
they
right?
really
It's all
do.
very Italian sounding.
They are
yeah.
Italian sounding. You're totally right. Yeah.
Yeah,
A lot of double vowels.
Horatius.
Double consonants and as well.
Yeah, I appreciate the consistency of like Horatius and Mopatis. Like the
Novatus. Yeah, the names are. George is pretty good about that, keeping them pretty consistent. There's a Pentoshi phrase that says, "Never ask the baker what went into the pie. Just eat." It's kind of like don't ask what's in the sausage, or you don't want to see how the sausage is made. But it's also kind of like don't ask questions. Like, just accept it. Just don't keep your nose in your own business or that kind of thing. Like I feel like you can read into that motto for like some attitudes the city might have. Because a lot of dirty things happen in this city, and you might, like people doing things they're not supposed to. So you might be like a don't be a snitch type vibe that gets trickled down from the elite and spread to the commoners, and be like, that's our vibe here. We don't talk. What happens in Pentos stays in Pentos.
Maybe a slightly less cynical take is don't look a gift horse in the mouth.
Okay,
Like,
sure.
hey,
That's a
this
good
stuff's
point.
good, right? We're living a good life,
like
you
that.
know? So here, just accept it for what I do think clearly there's a theme of slavery, you know, so that's another ball. By the way, Genoa, key in slave trade in
Mhm.
colonial times. So.
Let's talk a little bit about the way the city is laid out. It commands a large area, as we described just before in the region section. The city is of the greatest interest, though. Of course, we don't have a great idea of what it looks like, and even less of what it looked like long ago. We see most of what we see is Illyrio's manse, and very little outside that. But there is some, enough to make use of and make some educated guesses. And we see examples, as we do throughout the world, of it maybe not being so much having the vibe that it was founded under, of being a place of plucky merchants and traders. Now it seems to have maybe become a place of the haves and have-nots, where the state of unfettered capitalism has gone on so long that it's the people with money have taken over to the extent that they're changing the way things work and affecting the laws and in ways that are eliminating the middle class. It's something that happens in the real world, certainly. For example, when they head out to Dany 1 to meet Khal Drogo, the streets are not lit at all, which is kind of telling. Here's a quote.
The streets of Pentos were pitch dark when they set out in Illyrio's elaborately carved palanquin. 2 servants went ahead to light their way, carrying ornate oil lanterns with panes of pale blue glass, while a dozen strong men hoisted the poles to their shoulders.
You would expect to see a city put up lights on the streets. Like, that's normal. You see that in King's Landing. You see that pretty much everywhere. Or to at least you see, like, residual lights from inhabitants. It's kind of odd that it's pitch black, but not where we see Dany and company go. It's an easy thing to take for granted in the modern world, lighting. I mean, it's just everywhere now. We have so many lighting devices. And it's cheaper. We don't have to... I mean, there are still places in the world that don't have access to electricity, but electricity is pretty cheap compared to burning wood and coal and having to constantly resupply yourself with that.
Cheaper and safer and more infrastructure. There's less likely to start fires, to be polluting the air, and so on else. So.
This is why I'm talking about, like, the elimination of the middle class, perhaps, in Pentos. Like, these are the people that would complain about the lack of this. Like, hey, our tax money goes towards this. The rich don't care because they can easily, this is like a penny to them. Like, relatively speaking, they can afford to light their own homes and all this other stuff.
They carry a troop of light makers with them.
Yeah, exactly. And like, that's just another of Valyria's many servants. Like, what does he care? You know, like, this another item on the ledger. For him, it's barely anything. Like, the guy owns mines, farms, orchards, businesses. Like, it's nothing to him. But how do you it's hard to get that rich, or if not impossible to get that rich, without stepping on a lot of people's throats or hands or both, or doing worse than that. To own that many businesses, to have that much wealth. Yeah.
I didn't think of this either, but I seem to remember there was a passage where they're kind of describing the nature of the slaves in Pentos, to where, like, you're ostensibly free as long as you don't owe money.
Debt slavery, they have, yes.
Right? So, and one way that is you don't pay them enough to earn,
yes.
to get above the food they're being provided. And so a job like lighting candles at night, that's enough. That's not enough work to justify enough pay to pay for your food. And so Ilario gets to just keep them all as slaves. Yep. And he does feed them. He gives them basic sustenance for life, but they'll never earn enough paying that back just lighting candles at night. And so he gets slaves within the law, you know. So
I want to jump ahead a little bit, because what you said was really insightful there, and it sort of touches on something that Nina and myself both made note of in the document here. That Illyrio has this odd line that he says to Tyrion, which is like, "My household loves me well; they'd never betray me." And it's like, what a strange thing to say for a guy who's lived a life of intrigue. Like, how could he possibly trust his household that much? So maybe it's something he says to just change the subject or to move on. Like, he doesn't really believe that, but he's just kind of gaslighting Tyrion for some reason. Or maybe it's this, like, the lamp guy's not going to betray Illyrio because he's got nowhere else to go. He's got no one else willing to take him. Like, if he quits Illyrio, he's going to be a beggar, a homeless beggar on the street. Like, the other light post jobs are all taken by other people and other magistrates, other rich people in Penta. He's like, it's like, hey, do you need a new light guy? Like, no, course I don't need a new light guy. I never have an opening. When I have an opening, I fill it like that. Like, we never have like a job. We're waiting for not for someone who is basically unskilled anyway. So, yeah. So that's just the way it works. Like even the job market in a place like this is going to be just non-existent. You either do it yourself, or you get lucky. You get hired into something, or and it's not even necessarily luck because the job stinks and you're basically a slave.
Maybe it's even if it's still, can't think of the word, manipulative or underhanded or greedy or whatever, Ilario still there might be some truth to what he's saying, because he might be wealthy enough that he does pay all his servants enough to not want to revolt or betray,
right.
Like not enough to be free, but better than anyone else.
Yeah,
he might pay his,
that's a good point. Yeah. Well, so it's not
he may be wise enough to use his money in a way to keep things secure around him.
Like he's not doing it for good guy reasons, but you're right. It's just it's a form of ruthlessness. It's like calculated ruthlessness. Like, well, I will just pay them slightly more than everybody else, and that'll ensure their loyalty. Like they get 3 from someone else, I give them 4. Like, why would they quit for 3 when they can keep getting 4 from me? And Robert and Ned, when they're discussing like assassinating Dany, of course Ned hates the subject, but Robert is Robert, and he says, and this is one of the lines that we refer to when we point out how Viserys was talking about Illyria, the hired knives coming after him. It's like, no, there were no hired knives, because Robert's like, I should have gone after him when I had the chance. I should have had him killed when I had the chance. And he's like, well, that means you didn't try, did you? It's like, now he's in some walled mansion surrounded by pointy-headed eunuchs, and he's like, and Ned's like, you can't get to him now, can you? He's like, no, I can't. Which is really telling. Like, the king on the Iron Throne can't get inside this one mansion in Pentos. Like, he can't bribe the right people. He can't.
Yeah.
None of these things. Well, partly because Robert's Master of Whispers is Varys. He's not gonna. That plan would never.
He doesn't want to.
Yeah, that plan would never work. But obviously, that's only part of the problem. Like, it's the problem. Despite Robert doesn't even know that Varys is connected to Illyrio, and he still has this issue without that problem. So yeah, it says a lot about the strength of Illyrio's like mansion. And it's like this walled, fortified mansion inside the. You don't do that if the city is like relatively safe and peaceful, and like that's the kind of thing you do when your city is descended into post-capitalism, where there's the haves and the have-nots, and you use security against the have-nots rather than pumping that money into the economy to make it like work for everyone.
It's also something you do when you have excess money.
Yes,
lower lords who might be wealthy and successful, but not as much as Ilario, might not necessarily be investing in that sort of security. The city isn't necessarily that bad off, but it is not that well off either.
Yeah.
Right?
We're told Pentos produces a lot of performers and sellswords, the type of profession that it's an independent profession. You don't get hired to do it. Well, you do if you're a sellsword. But you first have to get good at fighting in order to be hired to be a sellsword. Same as a performer. You get hired to perform, but you have to learn that on your own. And you rarely, like, you can maybe go to a school for that. It doesn't sound like there's performance schools in Pentos. It sounds like you sit there practicing juggling until you know how to do it. Like, you find 3 objects, like stones maybe. Like, basically your skills and your body are your source of your income, not something other people taught you, not education that you got at a university or a school or from middle class or wealthy parents. So Pentos produces a lot of people like this. For example, Penny and Oppo and their father, Hopbean, may not be from Pentos. We don't know where they're from, but they were hired in Pentos. It's a place where performers, it's a place for performers. A lot of them are produced there, so maybe they are from there, but we don't actually know.
If her name was Penna instead of Penny, we might be more sure.
That's a good point. But Oppo, though, that fits. It's got the double consonants and the O ending, right?
And the O, yeah.
That's right. Too bad we don't know what the Tattered Prince's real name is, but we could guess it ends in O.
Tato.
But it has a G.
I think it's Tato.
Tatio. The manse gifted to Khal Drogo, speaking of excess wealth, as you mentioned a minute ago, Sean, it has 9 towers and sits by the bay. They just gave it to him. They're like, here you go. We've got an extra 9-towered mansion for you. We just had an extra, My collection of mansions. What's one less, right? So extremely fancy and nice. But here's the thing. here's the quirk of this. Who owns it now? Like, Dothraki don't just pass their things down to their sons, right? You don't become Khal because your son was. Like, it happens occasionally. But that's because you earn it, like, or you're brought along and prove yourself. You don't just get it handed to you, right? So, yeah, who owns this thing now? They probably just took it back. And they're like, well, we'll hold on to it until another call, until some other big call comes along, and we'll give it to that guy. But Dany might show up and being like, so this is mine, right? Because it was my husband's. Where's my manse? You know, that might be like a way for her to, negotiate.
Another wrinkle to that is it probably wasn't just sitting empty while Drogo was running around on his horse, right?
I mean,
they probably were renting
it
out to people. They were probably holding events and storing stuff, and like they're like, yeah, sure, it's yours. We'll see you later. And they just went back to their regular business. You know, maybe they cleared some certain areas out or took the most valuable stuff. But
he hardly used it. Like we see when he's there, and then Dany and Viserys show up. He meets them and he leaves. He goes to his Khalasar out in the sea, and then he's like, y'all can stay here. Danny and Viserys get to stay at the 9-towered mansion. Drogo only stays there like a day or two. He's like, I'd rather be with my men, you know. I'm a Khal. I'm like, yeah, okay, I get it.
He would never notice or care that the top 3 floors of each tower were storing grain. You know, I guarantee you that whoever gave it to him was still profiting off of it.
Yeah. Now, something Ashaya mentioned earlier comes up here. I had this in the notes. When Dany shows up for him to meet Drogo, there's other calls. There's other highborn people. There's red priests. There's sellswords and bravos. So there's lowborn and highborn. There's elites. There's everything. But there's no women. 0. Dany's like, I'm the only woman here. What the hell? That's weird, right? Like, I don't quite understand that, but I think maybe Pentos might be even more gendered as a society. It might be worse than average, which is pretty bad in this setting for excluding women from power. Like, they might, like, they're not even there. Like there would be some women there. Like, this is a fancy, like, wedding. Like, that's weird, right?
Is it a Pentos thing or it
might be
a Dothraki thing?
Oh, it could be a Dothraki thing. Yeah, maybe that was
or
for
a
the
mix.
Dothraki. Yeah, that's a good point, because the Dothraki women definitely are treated very low.
Yeah, maybe they just, like, I could see that, like, maybe the Pentoshi were like, let's not have any women here because those Dothraki are gonna, like, just take our women.
They're specifically rapers and pillagers. Like, what is anyone in Pentos going to do if some Dothraki warrior comes up and just kidnaps some girl?
Takes your daughter, takes your wife, whatever. What are you going to do? You're going to fight them? Just don't bring your wives or your daughters to this event, right?
You're right. I think this is a great guess. Yeah, I think you guys may have nailed it. That did not occur to me, but yeah, you're right. Totally right. Like, we saw what happened at the wedding. Like, they just grab each other and like. Oof. Okay, yeah.
It may even on some level make Dany seem more special too.
Yeah.
Maybe.
It might also make her seem more scared or be more scared.
Which she was.
But they're not.
It definitely had that effect. She was. It did. Yeah. That was her reactions. Like with a start of fright, she noticed that she was the only woman there, or something like that.
You know, it's like not hard to be the most beautiful woman at the event when you're the only woman.
Yeah, that's right.
Depending on the street.
Yeah. That's the Flight of the Conchords song.
She's the most beautiful woman I've ever seen eating a horse kebab. Or a horse heart kebab, yeah. Yes, that was, in fact, a Flight of the Conchords reference. I couldn't get it for a second there. Let's talk about government and religion in Pentos. Here's a quote from Illyrio.
That's you, Sean, unless you want me to read it.
Sorry. In Pentos, we have a prince, my friend. He presides at ball and feast and rides about the city in a palanquin of ivory and gold. 3 heralds go before him with golden scales of trade, iron sword of war, and the silver scourge of justice. On the first day of each new year, he must deflower the maid of the fields and the maid of the seas. Ilario leaned forward, elbows on the table. Yet, should a crop fail, or war be lost, we cut his throat to appease the gods and choose a new prince from amongst the 40 families.
Now this, in the World of Ice and Fire, describes this very similarly. It basically backs Illyrio up, and it suggests that this is perhaps arising from the mysterious origins of pre-Valyrian Pentos. So yeah, maybe the beliefs of the original Pentoshi are reflected here. Because this isn't Valyrian, although they're not opposed to sacrifice, certainly. They have different reasons for it. And Valyrians, I don't think the Valyrians would have ever been cool with sacrificing members of the elite. that's kind of against the way they run things. So it's pretty interesting. This anecdote comes at a time when Tyrion is lamenting how he can't go back to Westeros because he's a regicide, kinslayer, and traitor. And Illyrio basically waves that off like, that's nothing. A king can just say, you're absolved. And it's just as simple as that. It really is just that simple. A king can absolve you of all that, literally all of it, and everyone has to treat you like you have broken no laws. Now, that doesn't mean they will, but as far as the official authority goes, you're all well and good. Illyrio's right. If Dany or young Griff were to just declare Tyrion okay, then he is A-okay, unless that king is then overthrown and an anti-Tyrion person is put in their place and reverses all that. But basically, Illyrio is right to point to just the way their system works that even Tyrion isn't really taking proper account of. And then he sort of looks down on. He's like, well, look, and you look down on the will of kings and princes because he's Pentoshi in a society that has made a system out of sacrificing the nobility for their failures. And it's results-based, not process-based. They're not like, your plan was bad, so we're going to kill you. No, it's like bad things happened. They could be entirely not your fault. It can be obviously not your fault, but the will of the gods is what it is. I don't even know what gods we're talking about. Like, which gods? Like, they're not even named here. But yeah, but this practice is still in play. And in some ways it's really good because it keeps the excess of the nobility from the like tyranny. It prevents things like tyranny of one individual. It keeps like long-standing power. Power changes every year no matter what. That's good. But it sort of just shifts things towards that power. It doesn't remove that power. It just shifts that power towards the magisters and the 40 families. It's still there. It's still being wielded over the commons. It still is the reason there's no middle class now, or so it seems.
But it's harder for the power to be mobilized.
Yes, that's
it's harder for
It keeps
but there's also
it keeps the struggles internal rather than conquering out. Yeah.
There's a lot of pros and cons because things are less transparent. It's hard to know the motivations and actions of all these 40 people behind the scenes of this one leader, but at least this one leader can't just declare war or raise taxes 20% or something like that. There's another, I remember talking about this in the past. I wish I could remember which episode it was or what the context was, but I just remember thinking about the idea that it's maybe, I don't know how to say this exactly, but like more fair, better motivation for the leader. Like I think it even says in A World of Ice and Fire that there is it's sort of the prince is sort of just a figurehead, right? That he doesn't really have that much power. He's mostly just a figurehead, probably kind of like the modern Queen of England or King of England or whatever, But there still is some ability, some leadership that prince can wield, right? Like if he does take the initiative to set up grain storage and then there's a drought, hey, good thing I set up this grain storage. Mm-hmm. We're not all starving, so you don't have to kill me. They can plan ahead. They can take some action and wield some leadership. Even if it's only to keep themselves from being killed, it still will result with better policies and stabilization. And I can imagine a shrewd, proactive prince might do a lot, make a good positive difference, especially if he interacts with the different lords that chose him. But my guess is also they don't usually do that. Yeah. They aren't really aware. They live these pampered lives in ivory towers probably a mix of like the Tattered Prince ran away. He's like, screw that. I'm not going to risk getting myself killed.
Yeah, he's smart.
I think it'd be a neat story to learn about some of the details of those people, how they're chosen, how they deal with it and such.
Yeah.
But it is a lot of interesting dynamics from like a power and political standpoint.
Yeah, it's really like they have basically a built-in scapegoat for everything. So the nobility can constantly get away with whatever because this guy always gets the blame for it. Someone that they put in front of everybody to say, okay, this is our next sacrificial lamb for whatever crap we pull or whatever happens randomly. We're not going to take the fall for it no matter what. It's always going to be this person. And it's never a princess of the fields. There is the maiden of the fields and the maiden of the seas, which are part of that. It says the prince has to sleep with both of them as part of it, which is odd, but you can kind of see how that fits into ancient fertility beliefs and things of that nature. Yeah, Nina says it's a bit of having their cake and eating it too. There are advantages to having a single executive, which is why so many government systems do. In times of crisis or danger, it can be advantageous to have a single person who can make decisions on behalf of the state in the best interest of it. Obviously, assuming the leader actually has the best interest of the state in mind. The magisters of Pentos get the benefit of having a single executive in the moments where a single executive is advantageous. Like if there is a war, that guy is in charge. Even though there's powers behind the throne that can influence him, he's still going to have executive authority, but it's only going to last for a year, which is odd. Like if a lot of wars go for more than 1 year, so you can be kind of weird to change leadership midstream there, so that can be kind of problematic. But anyway, but ultimately it's just so very retrograde, just putting everything on results rather than process. It just makes me squirm. It's like no matter what, you're just going to blame someone for something that's out of their control. I hate the lack of accountability in the system. It's what bothers me.
It is, when you said though, it's as long as their motivations are also what's in best interest of the state, but they are more likely to be motivated what's in the best interest of their state if their life depends on it.
Yeah, that's true. Nina writes of the government of King's Landing and how it's like a parody of that, where the ritual intercourse between the prince and the maid of the sea and the maid of the fields feels like a caricature of the Westerosi obsession with sealing claims on power through dynastic marriages, which always puts the burden on the woman because they have to go join a new family and have kids with someone they didn't choose, and they're the glue that holds these alliances together without having very much say into it. Which in Pentos it seems like that's even more extreme. Like the women are even more marginalized and used as possessions. And it also says a lot about Illyrio, like what his values are and what he expects from this arrangement, what he expects to get out of his investment. He expects to benefit from putting Aegon on the throne, or Dany, or both of them, or whatever. And he expects the puppets to dance. He bribes them and wants results for those bribes. Like he bribed that one Volantine Triarch and enough to buy him 8 times over, it says, but he just still won't behave the way he expects. Now that's a person that would be hard for Illyrio to kill because he's a Triarch in Volantis, and that's far away, and it's no easy thing
position
to assassinate.
Power,
position
public,
power, but Dany or Aegon, I don't know. Maybe that's a different thing, especially if they have proximity to him. So yes, very interesting.
These motivations of Illyrio to these plays he's making, this money he's paying, these alliances, that he expects some sort of return. He expects to have some power behind the throne or whatever.
Yes.
So that's a weird, crazy thing about Illyrio.
Yeah, no, that's
Littlefinger, Tywin. Every other character has the same sort of. Most of the characters in powers of position have very similar sorts of motivations.
Yeah. Nina also writes that in addition to the aspect of marriages being sealed by women and women who are expected to be virgins for these arrangements, that comes up pretty big, and there's a few examples of this, like Tywin being perplexed that Tyrion won't sleep with Sansa, because once you do, she's basically yours, in quotes, you kind of own her at that point. Why don't you want to own her? I could think of several reasons. Well, but Tywin is still perplexed at Tyrion's answers. That's silly. You want her to love you? Are you stupid? She's not going to. Which in that much, Tywin,
thanks, Dad.
In that part, Tywin's right, but it doesn't have to be so rude about it. But still, Anyway, there's other examples once you have consummated the marriage, it's official. That is a thing that even in our society is somewhat established as that is still legally, to this day. It's a much easier to get an annulment in a marriage if it hasn't been consummated, right? The sex is still codified into marriage today in our world, and in a lot of Westerns. I can't speak to all world laws, but I know that's true in America. So, that's wild to think that, but of course there's a lot of religious influence on our lawmaking, so yeah, here you go. It's a parallel to the real world. So there's these 40 families we hear. The biggest power in Pentos is these 40 families, which is pretty interesting because there were 40 Dragonlord families. I wonder if they copied that number. Sean, you suggest maybe it's the other way around? That's possible, yeah. I'm not really sure.
Health.
So Nina says that seems extremely doubtful. Why would the Dragon Lords copy Pentos? Because they're so hoity-toity, and the elite won't copy someone else necessarily. I don't know if it's that simple, but yeah. I also just think Valyria probably had established that earlier, but maybe not. My headcanon would probably be that Pentos copied Valyria. But you're right, Sean.
Or maybe some other central thing that they both were copying.
Okay,
it's also a possibility.
Sure. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, like something older, maybe something from Ashai or Sarnor, who knows. But Nina also points out that there was the 40 families, 41, eventually after some infamous deadlock, electors who historically chose the Doges of Venice, which, not quite Genoa, but very similar, regionally connected. So you have the 40 families of Venice choosing the Doge, which is basically the prince. So that feels very much an homage. The Pentoshi gods. We don't know that much about them. We know that, there's this belief that may predate Valyrian influence about the prince and the maiden of the fields and maiden of the seas. But apparently there's more that just hasn't been revealed. Here's a quote from Fire and Blood.
Many a queer god is worshipped in Pentos, but Draz was known to keep but one, a small household idol like unto a woman great with child, with swollen breasts and a bat's head.
Yeah.
She is all the god I need, was all he would say upon the matter.
Yeah, what does that mean? She was all the god I need. Like, that's your one god, a bat-headed pregnant lady? That's weird, man. It's very Lovecraftian. It's like George R. R. Martin's default for obscure gods is Lovecraft. He's like, I'm going to make it some animal head, which actually isn't that different from like Egyptian gods all have animal heads. So maybe I'm reading too much Lovecraft into it, because there is a lot of Lovecraft in his other gods, but still. The swollen breast and pregnancy is very common for fertility idols, though. Very common for gods and idols and things, objects of worship. So that part, George is attaching to a very common religious tradition from the real world. So that's cool. Now, of course, the sacrifice part is also a big part of real world traditions here and there. And like Nina says, the Doges of Venice would do a marriage of the sea every year. The Doge and his court would sail out to a barrier island in the lagoon of Venice. The Patriarch of Venice would preach a benediction, and then the Doge would throw a ring into the sea while announcing that Venice was thereafter wedded to the sea. And every year they would renew this. So this is very similar, just a lot less bloody, and they're just getting rid of a ring instead of a person. Nina writes, Casanova joked that if the famous Bucentaur, the ceremonial barge of the Doges, capsized during the event, the Doge would finally be able to consummate the marriage. We love the name Casanova. One of our cats is named Casanova. That's right. And Nina says, also, there is a parallel with the Aztec feast of Toxcatl. Ahead of the feast, a young male warrior, typically a prisoner of war, would be chosen to impersonate the god Tezcatlipoca and would live in luxury and be revered as a god for 1 year. At the end of the year, after marrying 4 women, so he gets a nice send-off, I guess, the impersonator of the god would be sacrificed. You get a year of extreme luxury, culminating with marrying 4 women and then being killed. Like, damn. And then they would do that all over again. So yeah, that's very similar as well. You can really see a lot of, it's amazing how many of these elements of Pentos are in the real world. Like, yeah, the real world used to do this too, y'all.
Can I be chosen for that when I'm 75?
Yeah. Tyrion would be that. It's like, when I'm in 80, I want to die with a full belly of wine, a hand on each bra. Yeah, that's pretty close, right?
Oh wait, bonus points, Aziz, for pronouncing Tezcatlipoca correctly.
Did I?
I think it was correctly.
I was like, I just kind of threw it out. Cool. All right.
So bonus points for pronouncing it smoothly, however correct it might have been.
I made it sound right. Just say it confidently. Most of y'all aren't going to know if I got it right or not. Like, that's probably right. So here's a quote that combines a lot of what we've learned here. A lot of the elements from what we've discussed, both regional, religious, ancient history, sacrifice, other ethnicities, all in one. Quote.
An old legend told in Pentos claims that the Andals slew the swan maidens who lured travelers to their deaths in the velvet hills that lie to the east of the free city. A hero, whom the Pentoshi singers call Huko, led the Andals at that time, and it is said that he slew the 7 maids, not for their crimes, but instead as sacrifice to his gods. There are some maesters who have noted that Huko may well be a rendering of the name of Hugor.
So Huko certainly, or Huko maybe, certainly sounds like it fits with the naming conventions from before. The double consonant and the O finisher. Yeah, very much on point there. So that's cool. You got some Pentoshi or Andal hero that the Pentoshi had their own name for, maybe sort of loosely in the tradition of Azor Ahai, where you have different names maybe for the same heroic figure. This is, of course, not some sort of big legendary hero that's remembered for all time. This is a much smaller scale person. But still, if they led people to slay the swan maidens who were capturing people and pulling them under sea, that's a pretty important thing. To stop the ravaging of the evil of the swan maidens. It would sound kind of like sirens, really, you know.
That's what I was equating in my mind.
Yeah. Either way,
it still seems like I fought a lion with my bare hands. I slayed the dragon with my sword. I killed some women.
Some swan women.
They sang though. They were beautiful. Okay, what point am I supposed to be happy you did this?
Where's the heroism here? Like, where was the hard part? Like, what did you have to overcome? Like, decency, you know, like your morals. You had to overcome my morals to slay these innocent women. Well, maybe they're not innocent, but yeah. Anyway,
maybe
it doesn't sound good, does it? Yeah. Now, of course, there's also non-Pentoshi gods worshipped in Pentos, as we saw in Dany's wedding. There were red priests everywhere, including one that was bigger than Illyrio. Which is meant to show, I think, the corruption, the degradation of, you know, your asceticism and things like that. If you're a priest and you've eating and drinking that much, how close to your god are you really? Unless your god is a god of, unless it's like, you know, you're in the cult of Dionysus. Or something. Then go right ahead then. You know, but R'hllor isn't really about that. Like Benero is like gaunt and yeah, Melisandre doesn't even eat or drink barely. She only does it just to keep up appearances, right? So, yeah. All right, that's our first half. We don't know what other gods are worshipped in Pentos, but we can assume it's kind of similar to a lot of places that have a trading port. Like, they're open to lots of different gods because you want the different sailors to have their needs met and not to have too many trouble. Not to have too much trouble. You want it to be a safe haven, a safe space for whatever god you want to worship. Whether it's the Black Goat of Qohor or the Weeping Lady of Lys or whatever. Yeah, so as we said at the beginning, you still have time to sign up to be part of our recurring hangouts, to join and play Whiplash or Trivia or whatever we're going to be hosting that particular month. You can do that for $2 a month if you sign up for Patreon now. That price goes away in August, so you still have time, but that time is dwindling.
We've got Whiplash, Trivia, some of the other Jackbox games, and next time we're going to do strip poker.
Are we? Okay, this is news to me.
You don't want to discourage people, Sean.
Depends.
I'm supposed to encourage them.
Depends on who's stripping. Yes. And yeah, so sign up now and lock your $2 price in for the length as long as you want, because that price will be gone, but you can grandfather yourself in and have a cheaper way to support us for the long term. Brandolin Price says, the prince to flowering 2 maidens a year for sea and land prosperity reminds me of the King's Stag ritual in the Mists of Avalon. Pentoshi definitely give me Celtic Gaelic vibes, not just that, but other parts of it at least as well. Yeah, I totally agree. I'm not super familiar with the Mists of Avalon. That's
You read that?
No.
Oh, I thought you did.
My mother read it.
Yeah.
Marion Zimmer Bradley, I believe. Unfortunately, Marion Zimmer Bradley is a horrible person, but that didn't come out until
I read the books long
very
before.
later. Yeah, like really, really bad person. Like George had cited her a number of times also because probably he didn't know what a horrible person she was, because that only came out like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Like after her death, basically. So she never had to answer for her crimes in life. But my God, the stories her children tell are just unbelievably bad. Yeah. So sorry about that, y'all. If you're a fan of Marion Zimmer Bradley, it's a rough way to find that out. But yeah, The Mists of Avalon was a really big story. It's really popular. It did really well. It's still widely read, I believe. I don't think that many people still don't know about the Marion Zimmer Bradley as a person, which would be a turnoff for a lot of folks. But most people just, you're not aware of it. How can you take that into account? So I can't comment specifically on the parallels because, like I said, I haven't read it. But my mom used to tell me a lot about it. She loved it.
Yeah, they were good.
Right on. Lolotov. Nice name.
Love that name.
That's great.
Yeah.
Lolotov. I like not having firm ideas of population. It's not like anyone is going out and counting. Yeah, why would they have a census? And why would they? Yeah. Sir Eustace doesn't even know how many draftable peasants he has in 3 villages that live nearby him. Yeah, that's a great point. Like a more well-to-do lord might bother counting, but Sir Eustace, Eustace's lands have the feel of disrepair. Like he just doesn't care anymore. He's so sad and bitter and. Yeah.
It might not have as much to do with being well-to-do or not, with being competent or motivated
all
or.
those things, right. It's probably a lot of the above, not just one. Yeah.
By the way, I just want to point out. So, your shirt, by the way, Aziz, is the Valyrian steel crown.
Well,
right?
this is not the Valyrian. It should be, but as we saw on TV, this is the TV version of the crown, which looks like it's regular iron and not Valyrian steel. It's supposed to be Valyrian steel, but this is the TV version. And it doesn't look like Valyrian steel to me. It might be, but they called it iron in the show. So.
It's hard to capture it on a t-shirt.
Yes,
so
that's true.
I'm wearing a Star Trek shirt, like a classic Star Trek shirt with Uhura and Spock. But I just wanted to point out that I have a t-shirt on underneath this, which is a guy throwing a Molotov cocktail. So
not a Molotov cocktail. Actual Molotov. Yes.
If I had ever thought of that, I think I prefer Molotov cocktails.
Why are you wearing 2 shirts?
I'm wearing a shirt. Are you wearing 2 shirts? Are you really wear 2 shirts?
Yeah, he pulled his other shirt up.
I usually wear a t-shirt underneath.
You gotta bulk up.
Yeah. It's that icy Denver summer.
Yeah. I'm wearing.
It's pretty warm right now,
Can't
actually.
see it, but I'm wearing a Krusty the Clown shirt.
Oh
from The
yeah.
Simpsons.
If you wear it for several days, it'll be a Krusty the Clown shirt. I've got a crown. You've got a clown.
Hey, that's true.
So don't frown. Let's talk recent history of Pentos. Since most of our sources are Westerosi, much of what we know about Pentos comes from dealings with Westeros, or when the conflicts are big enough for Westeros to take note. And of course, that is fueled by the proximity as well. We don't hear actually that much about the Doom from Pentos' perspective, probably because, even though it had to have been a big deal, the fact that there was a lesser concentration of highborn Valyrians, probably less visits by dragon lords and less estates and mansions owned by dragon lords, it probably just had a smaller effect overall. I mean, not that it wouldn't have been big, but compare it to Qohor, where a dragon lord raised the population to make an army, or Volantis, where they just got all up in arms about conquering the other free cities. Pentos was more like, how do we protect our trade network? That's the people that ruled there did their thing. And you wonder how the transition of the whole Prince of Pentos system and sacrifice, how that existed under the Freehold versus not. Like, did this system come back after the Freehold? Did they not have that when the Freehold was around? I don't think so. I think they did. Because they were allowed to run the city the way they wanted. I mean, that's why they're called the free cities. The Valyria just expected things from them, but it didn't interrupt their day-to-day way of handling their business or their local politics. So I think they probably still had that Prince of Pentos thing. Otherwise, it wouldn't have survived to the modern times, probably. I doubt they revived a thousands-of-year-old tradition that no one had done in like 5,000 years, although the Ironborn did that with the Kingsmoot. Still, it was unlikely.
But it was kind of... note was made that they were redoing that,
yeah,
right?
Exactly.
And
they were like, "Oh, what a good idea!" And that's a one-time thing, maybe not a recurring thing. I don't know. Maybe it'll be a recurring thing, but anyway,
too early to tell.
Yeah,
but we did also get the perspective that it has come to be more of a position of what's the word I'm looking for? Ceremonial. So more, It's come to be more ceremonial.
Yes.
So that seems like something that would have had to have happened. And I wonder if under the Freehold it might have actually been more authoritative or meaningful.
Or maybe that's why it became so ceremonial, because they couldn't. They had to exercise less power under the Freehold's guiding or domain. Yeah. But maybe not if they just But either way, I could see it becoming because of that, more ceremonial, because it had less legal authority under the Freehold. Maybe now, and after so long, it didn't revert to being a thing of power after thousands of years of just being ceremonial.
I kind of hope and expect to find out more. I mean, it just takes one more conversation between Ilario and Varys or Tywin or not Tywin, Tyrion or whoever, to just 2 or 3 paragraphs can just explode the amount of knowledge that we have.
I agree. I think we're going to learn more. I mean, as we've said, and it's not casual, there's a lot of reason to think there's plenty more is going to happen in Pentos, and that's got to involve some more description of the city, if not its history. So when Volantis tried to begin their imperial pretensions, Pentos was one of those who formed the alliance to stop them. In fact, Pentos and Tyrosh, at first they had the help of Argilac the Arrogant, and eventually Pentos and Tyrosh actually sent people to go talk to Aegon, the Conqueror, before he was the Conqueror. And he joined them and, burned that fleet at Lys and fought the Volantines. So Pentos and Aegon had a little bit of relationship there. The Dothraki emerging during the Doom and the Century of Blood would be the start of their policy of huge bribes, right? They wouldn't have needed to do that before. They would have had, the Dothraki wouldn't be ranging all the way across the entire freehold to get to Pentos. That would be an extremely remote location for them to even begin to approach, and the Dragon Lords would have stopped them. So yeah, this would be a completely one of the biggest features of the new world of the post-Doom world for them to deal with, the existence of the Dothraki, the emergence of the Dothraki. That's probably when that Sphinx was taken, right? And it would be a symbol of the new world. They're like, well, we're no longer bowing down to the Sphinxes. We're bowing down to the people that can take the Sphinxes back to their home really, really far away. How far? They wheeled that thing on logs like, damn, that's far. Yeah, but it's not nearly the first time they've done something like that. So we very frequently see Pentoshi guests at major Westerosi events like weddings, coronations, tourneys, too many to list, really. When Maegor went into exile after refusing to give up his second wife, he took Blackfyre, his second wife, and Balerion with him to live there. His second wife stayed when he returned, but as soon as he won his trial of 7, she came over, so she was treated well over there in the meantime. I don't suppose they would want to piss Maegor off. That sounds like a really dumb thing to do. Grand Maester Bennifer fled to Pentos when Maegor took over. So Maegor comes over, Bennifer goes to Pentos. Like they switched places. And then when Maegor died, Lords Buckwell and Rollingford fled to Pentos, and Bennifer returned. So you have all these people that were going to Pentos to escape Maegor, and then going back to King's Landing when Maegor died. So a lot of just goes to show that it's just so close that it's a convenient place to flee to. It's the easiest place to find a ship to. If you got to get out in a hurry, you're probably going to get out to Pentos. Like Arya got shipped to Braavos. That was kind of random. It was more likely that the first ship she stumbled on would have been a Pentoshi. Of course, they wouldn't have taken her because she didn't have money. They only took the Bravo ship only took her because she had the right coin. But still, George didn't need to write like 5 different ships for her to get on before she found the right one. That would have been a bit of a waste. So yeah, 22 Magisters attended the Golden Wedding in 49 AC. And that's an interesting number because we don't know how many Magisters there are, but well, it's at least 22, and it's probably more than that because I doubt all of the Magisters attended. There's probably a few who were like too old to travel or just didn't want to or didn't think it was a good idea to put all your eggs in one golden wedding basket. I don't know. The next year, the year 50 AC, Rigo Draz was made Master of Coin. He was shunned for his low birth in Pentos, but he had become the richest man in the city. And Jaehaerys was like, well, that's the guy I want for my Master of Coin. He became unpopular, though, in Westeros, and eventually was murdered in the streets. And Jaehaerys was pissed. Jaehaerys hunted down those responsible and was vicious to them. There was no conciliating there. That was all justice for the murdered. Alyssa Farman passed through there several times under her real name and her assumed name, and before and after she had her ship, the Sunchaser. In 52, after being allies against the Volantines, Pentosh and Tyrosh entered a trade war. By the year 55, the trade war had run a long way, and they were both getting tired of it. So they had Jaehaerys try to conciliate for them. Like, hey, Jaehaerys, can you make the deal for us? Can you negotiate something for us? And he did. He negotiated a peace deal. And both sides were really unhappy about it. Tyrosh hated it, and the Prince of Pentos, who came to the deal, was sacrificed. Like, okay, well, there you go. That's not surprising, is it? They sacrificed their prince because they didn't like the result. The following year was when the Valyrian Area episode occurred, and there was reports that there was some monster in the Velvet Hills. And so William the Wasp, a Kingsguard knight, was dispatched with some soldiers to go see if it was Valyrian. It was not. It was an ambush, and they were all murdered. Sir William's head was returned to Rego Draz. I think it was Rego, and they wanted to go, like, one of the small counselors was like, well, we got to go punish the Pentoshi, and Jaehaerys is like, they're just brigands outside the city. Like, it's not the fault of the whole city. Like, we can't blame them for that. And Nina says, this may have been what Illyrio was referring to. There lived a den of robbers who preyed on all who passed this way. Well, this was a den of robbers who they used a really weird story, a monster that was killing people just maybe to hide the fact that it was them and to keep would-be authorities from coming, because authorities might be willing to hunt down people. They may balk at hunting down some monster. But William the Wasp was specifically hunting for a monster, so they had to check it out.
What house is William the Wasp from? Or is he from a house, or do we know?
I don't recall. I don't think he was a Beesbury, but he may have been.
Ooh.
I like the idea of that as like a Beesbury bastard kind of thing. Like
yeah.
Not quite a bee, but...
Someone could look that up while we're sitting here. Yeah, I don't recall what house he's from.
Oh, we do know? Okay.
I think so. In Fire and Blood, and as portrayed on House of the Dragon, Daemon...
Smallwood,
okay.
Yeah,
William Smallwood. Okay. Yeah, so I don't know why he's called William the Wasp. I forget.
I don't think I ever heard that character before, so it's cool.
Yeah, one of Jaehaerys' Kingsguard, of course.
He was just a sworn sword to Miles Smallwood.
Oh, okay. So he
literally might have just not...
No last name, no house.
No last name, no house. Yeah, my bad.
Cool. All right. Maybe that's, yeah, so he probably took that as his personal sigil, a wasp. That might explain it. Anyway, that's not too relevant to Pentos. In Fire and Blood, and as portrayed on House of the Dragon, Daemon and Laena were courted by the Prince of Pentos, not just for their prestige, but because they saw the Triarchy as an enemy, and the Triarchy hated Daemon. So they're like, well, the enemy of the enemy is my friend kind of situation. That scene was pretty cool on House of the Dragon with the Prince of Pentos. Like, and Daemon's just like, sitting there reserved, like, yeah, I hear all your praise. I know what you're after here, bro. I know what it's, I'm not blown away by all your generosity. I know I'm a badass, powerful badass that you want as an ally, and I'm not going to come cheap. And of course, Bela and Rhaena were born there, and of course, Laena died there too. But in the books, Laena dies in Driftmark, so that's a difference that's worth pointing out here. She doesn't die in Pentos in the books. And Rhaena is called Rhaena of Pentos for a long time. So that's kind of fun to point out as well. At the end of the Dance of the Dragons in the year 131, Pentos joined with Braavos and Lorath to take on the Triarchy. This is one of the many backs and forths over the Stepstones. It's nothing new. We talk about it in our Stepstones episode. And of course, it doesn't stop here. It's an ongoing fight. But Pentos was later cut out of the deal. They were an ally with Braavos and Tyrosh later. Lorath was also no longer part of it by this time. And they just got excluded. They're like, actually, Pentos, you're not part of this. We're going to take over the Stepstones with our other allies, and you get screwed. What's interesting about this is Pentos had 2 centuries of war off and on with Braavos that overlaps this time of being their ally. So maybe this is part of why they were cut out of the deal, or part of why hostilities resumed, because they were maybe had been some bad blood, or this brought the bad blood back. Because, yeah, 6 wars with Braavos. And so at least one of those 6 would have happened by the point where they were an ally with Braavos, and then subsequently dumped from that alliance, because the final of those 6 wars was in the year 209, so for it to have happened over the course of 2 centuries, we got to go well before 131 to cover 2 centuries from 209. That's only like 78 years. So, yeah. Since Braavos, Tyrosh, and Rindoon ended up losing to the sneak attack of Oakenfist, who earned his nickname Oakenfist in that sneak attack, Pentos could look at that as sour grapes. Like, good thing they cut us out of the arrangement, because then we would have fought a losing naval battle against the Westerosi. So it might have been worked to their benefit. They weren't on the losing side of that and didn't have to worry about it. And only a few years later, things got so much better. The Lysine Spring was in full swing. Aha, poetry. And trade in the Narrow Sea was peaking. It was booming. And of course, if trade in the Narrow Sea is booming, Pentos is benefiting greatly. As we pointed out earlier, they're literally in the center. So they had to do quite well with that. But then we get back to these wars with Braavos. As I said, the first 2 centuries of Targaryen rule in Westeros coincided with Pentos fighting those 6 wars with Braavos. It may have been in part because of that. Something that changed in the Narrow Seas paradigm because of Aegon and King's Landing being built and formed and all this new stuff happening may have changed just the scenario for a lot of houses, and that may have trickle-down effect of that may have been some new trade wars fighting. And of course, we're still relatively new in Braavos' existence at this point. So a lot of things changed.
Ostensibly, at least, Braavos was fighting over slave trade too.
Yes.
Right? Like, I'm sure they don't mind the side effect of, the loot and pillage, the land they take from Pentos or whatever, but that was at least ostensibly a motivation.
Yeah, so there's at least there's 3 things they fought over, apparently. One was, slavery, Braavos trying to stop them from it, also over trade, and also over land. Of course, land is the most common thing we see people fighting over, I suppose, not ideological things, but in this, it's all of those things. So Pentos lost 4 of those 6 wars, and one of their 2 wins was pretty sketchy, as I'll bring up in a minute here. It wasn't even necessarily a win, but the 6th of the wars was in the year 209. That ended in 209, which is the same year as the Hedge Knight and the Great Spring Sickness. The Great Spring Sickness may have also, in fact, likely hit Essos as well. It probably wasn't only confined to Westeros. And if it hit Westeros, including King's Landing, which it hit big time, it almost certainly hit Pentos, which is, as it says, daily there's ships going back and forth between the 2 places. It's pretty hard for Pentos to have escaped that. So this would have been an ongoing thing that flared up from time to time between Braavos and Pentos. Nina says, the fact that Braavos was willing to fight 6 wars over, at least in part, over an ideological issue means that Braavos was feeling pretty secure about itself in their position at the time, that they would be willing. Like, you don't start ideological wars unless you got crazy people or you're very well prepared to do so. Like, it's almost a luxury to start an ideological war. It's a weird way to phrase it, but you kind of see where I'm coming from. Like, wars are expensive, and if you're not fighting them over things that you get a profit from, then you must really care about this, and you must really have enough to afford it. Yeah, so both things have to be in place for it to happen. So in that year 209, while people were dying of the spring sickness, 4 princes of Pentos were executed due to failures in 1 year due to this failing in the war. The 5th prince was a guy named Nevio Neratis. He found a way to end the war. He apparently bribed some Bravosi to lose a battle, or at least make it look like a loss, or something in between. Then he convinced the Magisters of Pentos to take the leverage of this sketchily won battle and use it to sue for peace. Of course, the peace he was trying to protect is synonymous with his own head, right? Because if he fails here, he's going to die. To be the 5th prince executed in 1 year, you got to be pretty thick to not see that possibility. It's like, oh, what am I so worried about? I don't know. And this is where Nina says, there may be a sense here in which the power of the magistrates is not infinite either. Yes, they can sack and murder any prince they like at pretty much any time, but if they exercise that power too frequently, the puppet won't do what the puppet's supposed to. The puppet's going to very obviously try to save its own life, right? Like, it's just too blatant in cases like this. Like, 4 princes murdered or executed in 6 or 7 months or whatever, however long it was, less than a year. So, very blatant, right? This whole system of ritualized victim blaming or whatever, not even victim blaming, just blaming a guy, scapegoatery, it really starts to fall off a little bit in situations like this where it just becomes, self-defeating.
It's also, the limits of how and why people accept the government can be pushed.
Yeah.
Even Ares, the king, at some point, feel like, okay, well, we're going to revolt now. At some point, you don't have trust in the leader. And so if ostensibly the idea is it's the prince's fault, and so we're going to kill him and get a new one, well, like, he's only been prince for like a month. Like, how much of his fault? Like, even the people at some point are going to have to blame someone or something other than the prince, who hasn't been there long enough to actually have an effect, right?
Yeah.
And so they're going to start to look to other solutions. Hey, you magistrates choosing this prince, maybe it's your fault. Like, they're probably happy and or encourage this prince to come up with a plan.
That's a good point. Yeah, you're right. Like, how do the magisters escape culpability for their selection in the first place? Like, well, we killed him, but you chose him. Like, you picked this guy. Yeah. So shouldn't some of the blame fall on you? Yeah, that's a good point. Like, if they're not careful around it, the whole narrative can flip on them, and the whole point is for them to absolve themselves permanently of any end of sentence. Absolve themselves permanently. And so that's a really good point. And Nina also makes another good point about, from Braavos' perspective, yes, there's the ideological thing, they want to do away with slavery, but also in terms of the land. Yeah, we talk about how fertile it is, so it's very valuable land, and Braavos itself is low, unfarmable land. They're living in that lagoon, in a misty lagoon. They don't have a lot of farmland. So controlling farmland is very valuable to them, not to mention they can build a ship in one day. Braavos can. Very famously, the Arsenal can do that. Arsenal with a capital A, right? And but to fuel the arsenal, you got to have timber to build those ships with. And the Flatlands, we know there's orchards. There's probably other timber. Some of those orchards might literally be just timber farms, right? That's a thing. Well, we have farms also. So either way, they're not buying all their wood from the forest of Qohor, although they probably are getting some of it that way. But they'd rather get it themselves and not have to pay for it. And if you conquer the proper land that has the trees, then you can do that. And relevant to that is Pentos' relative weakness and vulnerability to warfare, which the Braavosi were sure to take note of. And after losing this final war, the sixth war, the one they sued for peace over, when they lost in 209, this is when they abolished slavery by order of the Braavosi. This is the anecdote mentioned by Illyrio, but also their navy was reduced to 20 ships. Braavos was like, you can't have more than 20 warships for your state navy, and no sellswords. You can't hire sellswords. Now, I don't know how they would be stopped from doing this. If they hire sellswords, it would probably be to fight Braavos and to throw off this yoke that Braavos has placed on them. But they would have to do that secretly before Braavos got wind of it, and maybe that would have to be handled carefully. So, and in the meantime,
it limits on how many and how quick they could do it without it being discovered.
Yeah, and in the meantime, what are they going to do with just 20 ships? Like, they're going to build some ships in secret? That's really hard to do. Building ships in secret is hard to pull off. So
it's enough to defend what they have, but not enough to go attack someone else, which is what Braavos is worried about, right?
And so that's super relevant going forward as well. It's only 20 ships and no sellswords. We talked about why Pentos is vulnerable. Well, there you go. That's damn. Like, that's all they have? Dany, like, one strafing run on Drogon, and that's the 20 ships gone right there, and let alone someone else coming. Like, if the Tattered Prince brings the Windblown in, like, those ships aren't good for anything against his land assault,
It's worth noting that it's still, like I was trying to point out earlier, that I think that I think their defense is the value that they provide to everyone by being this hub of commerce. It just doesn't behoove anyone. China could take over Taiwan if they wanted to relatively easily, but it's just not worth it. Mm-hmm. Like, it's not worth destroying this profitable center. You make more from it by it existing than taking it over.
Yeah.
Same thing, kind of like Japan after World War II had to forego its military, but the U.S. and most of the rest of the world didn't want it to continue warring. It wanted it to be productive. Everyone benefited from it focusing on productivity rather than warfare. And so I feel like that's a big part of where Pentos' security comes from is the lack of motivation to attack it.
Yeah.
Now that might fall apart. It had, same thing could be said of Genoa, but it still got attacked, several times over the centuries.
Unlike the Dothraki, right? Like the Dothraki they get tons of money from Pentos. What's different about Pentos is like, well, Dany's like, why don't the Dothraki just destroy the slaver cities? It'd be easy. It's like, well, they have nowhere to sell their slaves to. Well, they're not selling their slaves to Pentos. There is, because slavery is illegal there, right? Now there is slaves in Pentos. That's actually our next section, but especially because the Dothraki aren't going to travel all the way to Pentos to sell, even if they could sell them there. Why would they go all the way to Pentos when Astapor, Yunkai, Marine, Valant, these are all much closer to the Dothraki Sea. Qohor, all these places are way closer. I don't know why they would walk all the way over there to do that. They would only come all the way to Pentos to marry Daenerys or something like that, or if something very big changes and they actually want to attack it. But yeah, they come there, they get their money, and then they go home. So yeah, that's part of,
like, they can making numbers up, but they can go to Pentos once a year and get 8,000 gold pieces, or they could sack the city and get 30,000 gold pieces one time, and then nothing next year, nothing next year, nothing next year. So it's better to just maintain this profitable system.
Yeah, like if Khal Drogo were to sack Pentos, well, he just destroyed the city where they gave him a 9-tiered mansion. Like, doesn't he? Wouldn't he rather just have that and not fight at all and just go fight someone else? Like, and also, the Dothraki like a challenge, and it wouldn't be one. I was like, this would be too easy, So
the challenge would be the other Dothraki hordes that also go to Pentos for tribute that are now mad at them. The other free cities that depend on trade for minute that now feel like they need to do something about the Dothraki. Like, people would mobilize in response. So.
It's true. So Brandolyn Price sends a super chat, says, great stream. I'm glad I was able to make it live for the first time in a while. Well, to any of you else who has trouble making it to our streams on a regular basis, we appreciate when you can make it, and we love your participation. Super chats are a great way to support the show. You can also support us through the other means we suggest from time to time: Patreon, Spotify, or donations through our website. Yeah, let's talk about the situation of slavery in Pentos, because, well, it's been banned, but it still happens. And we see that in a number of places through a number of POVs. Let's talk about it first off with Tyrion.
Slaves? The dwarf asked pointedly. The fat man stroked one of the prongs of his oiled yellow beard, a gesture Tyrion found remarkably obscene.
Sorry, I was muted. Sorry. Slavery is forbidden in Pentos by the terms of the Treaty of Braavosi. Slavery is forbidden in Pentos by the terms the Treaty the Braavosi imposed on us 100 years ago. Still, they will not refuse you.
Tyrion figured it out quickly enough, but long before that, in her first chapter, Dany did as well. Here's that quote.
Illyrio's servants entered, bowed, and set about their business. They were slaves, a gift from one of the Magister's many Dothraki friends. There was no slavery in the free city of Pentos. Nonetheless, they were slaves. The old woman, small and gray as a mouse, never said a word, but the girl made up for it. She was Illyrio's favorite, a fair-haired, blue-eyed wench of 16 who chattered constantly as she worked.
Another fair-haired, blue-eyed person, very young, that Illyrio is favorite. Now, remember when Illyrio's like, I almost slept with Dany myself, but thought she was too timid, and then I summoned my bed warmer and slept with her instead. It's probably this girl. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, yeah, he's gross. But you knew that already, yeah. So, but the point here is to talk about how these women and these servants have no choice. They're basically slaves. Like Sean said earlier, a lot of them are bonded slaves. They're in debt permanently to Illyrio. So this is a city that is very sophisticated in its way of getting around the laws imposed on them. They've had almost 100 years. It's been the year 209 is when this was imposed on them. So they've had 81-ish or 91-ish years of figuring out how to have slaves without officially having slaves. And that encompasses all of Illyrio's life. Illyrio's entire lifespan has come in this span of existence for Pentos, when slavery has been banned, but still happens quite a lot. It doesn't really look like they're hiding it all that well. I mean, a 13-year-old girl figured it out immediately, right? I mean, Dany is insightful, but she can't be the only one. Like others have noticed this. But what Braavos is, I guess, content to just let things be the way they are for now. And that could prove very interesting if Dany becomes displeased with this arrangement. I mean, she noticed it right away. Is she going to come back and be like, all right, we're time to have a reckoning for this so-called free city? We've already talked about how the slaves will probably rise up in Volantis and welcome her there. Lys maybe as well. Tyrosh, perhaps. Now, I don't expect all these things to necessarily happen on screen. I could see us, my headcanon kind of is Dany having a chapter in Pentos where she's looking back on having just taken Lys and Volantis. Maybe we see Volantis, but Lys and Myr and Tyrosh, I kind of doubt it. Kind of doubt we see those firsthand from Dany's POV. Maybe we do, but in minor flashbacks after she's already done it, yeah, that'd be a way to get all that done without getting bogged down and having 3 different city taken over chapters, right? Just all the detail. I mean, I'm all for that, but I don't see it coming, you know?
It would mean another book.
Yeah, that's like a whole book of Dany's conquests throughout Essos, right? So it could really go a lot of different ways. Like Pentos, she could be like, this is bull. You guys, this fake non-slavery thing you're doing needs to end. I'm going to torch the whole thing. Or because they're so weak, maybe she just is able to knock them down and impose her will on them, which in a queer sort of way might save them from being destroyed. Because they're so weak, she might be able to coerce them into better behavior. Whether or not that holds is another matter, but the fact that they have a small military actually might save them, because they're not too tough a nut to crack. She doesn't have to just burn the whole thing down and start over. Although she might decide to do that anyway. But for now, she's actually kind of loyal to Illyrio. She's like, I don't want to give the city to the Tattered Prince. Illyrio lives there, and Illyrio's our friend. Like, well, Illyrio, I wouldn't call him your friend. He might be a benefactor, patron, supporter, perhaps, but yeah, he's not your friend. He will turn on you if he can, if he needs to, or if he sees the profit in it. So Dany may still have a little bit of naivete there, but Tyrion is not fooled, and Tyrion is not unlikely to be advising her and could quickly disabuse her of all that. On the other hand, Barristan says Dany should trust Illyrio, which is bad advice, but Barristan's not the most skilled at intrigue or such things. That's not his forte. A side effect of Braavos' small military and Pentos' small military imposed by Braavos is that a lot of people who would be soldiers, people who have that attitude, who are kind of have a warrior bent to them, there's no military for them to join. So there's a lot of sellswords up for hire there. A lot of Pentoshi sellswords exist. It's kind of alongside that, like performers and people who have to make a living with their bodies and their natural abilities rather than anything they can learn, because that's not available to them. So that could be important as well.
You know, I had this thought earlier when you mentioned that it's when it comes to being a sellsword, it's the willingness to risk your body. However good a soldier you are or aren't, just your willingness to get in the line of fire is, you know, when you don't have anything else, when you don't have another route out of poverty or slavery, that's a risk some people are willing to take.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's part of how you get good at being a warrior is you have to go to war. So
yep, take some risks and come out of it. You know, if you're lucky enough to survive, then you've got some credibility. So here's another quote from The World of Ice and Fire that talks about how this sort of is it or isn't it not slavery situation is handled.
These provisions remain the law in Pentos to this day, though certain observers have noted that many Pentoshi ships evade the prohibition against the slave trade by running Lysine or Myrish banners up their masts when challenged, whilst in the city itself there are tens of thousands of free bond servants who seem to be slaves in all but name, for they are collared and branded much like their counterparts in Lys, Myr, and Tyrosh, and subject to similar savage disciplines. In law, these bond servants are free men and women with the right to refuse service as they will, provided they are not in debt to their masters. Almost all of them are, however, since the value of their labor is oft less than the costs of the food, clothing, and shelter provided them by those they serve, so that their debt grows rather than diminishes over time.
You'd think they'd want to just return to outright slavery, but there might be elements in the city that prefer this sort of under-the-radar arrangement, even though it's not really that concealed. There might be more money in it for them. I'm certainly not ascribing empathic, sympathetic reasons here, just whatever makes them more money. Like they're given gift, like the whole thing of giving gifts, like the Dothraki, like that's not buying and selling slaves technically. It's another like legalese way to get around it. Like, oh, I didn't buy these slaves; they were given to me by a Dothraki. Do I have to free them now? Like, well, how does that even work? I don't know. There's probably weird, like obscure, arbitrary, like exceptions coded into the law, things like that.
Probably the biggest current motivation is to maintain this peace with Braavos, right? They made this treaty, this agreement that ended a war that included no slavery, no sellswords, and so on.
Yeah.
So maybe they quote unquote won it for the, economic benefits, of denying people their rights, but they are more than willing to semantically word it and organize it in a way that keeps peace with Braavos. And on some level, Braavos might even get it too. They might be like, they're not really following the rules. But how far do they have to go before we declare war again?
Yeah, and that's a big deal, like declaring, because it's probably they're still a trading partner, most certainly, and so a lot of aspects, a lot of people, a lot of powers in Braavos would be kind of wary of disturbing that, just to do something that maybe won't have any effect. Like if they can't enforce it, then like it'll probably just go back to this way. Like, I don't know if it would even.
It might even temporarily make things worse for the quote unquote slaves, and also they might have these unintended consequences with other alliances and trade agreements. Like if they attack Pentos, and that makes I don't know Cersei mad or whatever, and then she wants to do something in Bravo. So not that
the geopolitical
a lot of
balance
times even when you're right. Even when you're trying to do the right thing, sometimes you have to be careful to not make things, or your goal of doing the right thing is to make things better for everybody.
Yeah.
So when it comes to clearing war, you might not be making things better for everybody. You got to be really careful.
Yeah, that's true. Like Dany faced the same problem, in Meereen. That's the same thing she's learning about. She's like, like in the long term, all these people who would be enslaved, their lives are better. But in the short term, at least some percentage of these slaves are actually going to have a worse life because they had pretty good positions, like they were treated pretty well, like now they don't even have a job. They don't even have a place to live. Like they have their freedom, but like you're an 80-year-old person that's been a slave your whole life, you really like want to, like, what do you have now? Like that's not good, right? So it's tricky. Of course the better thing is to free
it, but you just have to plan it out well and make sure to think about the implications and on, and it's not that easy, especially for like this young girl who has no world experience, the leaders of Braavos haven't necessarily even figured it out, and ostensibly they have more experience and resources and such. So.
Yeah. So earlier I misspoke. You asked if we know of a female Pentoshi, and we do know one, and her name does end in A. Tiana of the Tower, Tiana of Pentos. Maegor, one of Maegor's wives, who was also basically his master of whispers. She was a torturer, a pretty nasty piece of work all around. She was a bastard daughter of a magister, and apparently a dancer. And very attractive, and we'll talk about her in detail some other day because she's a interesting character, and we'll have plenty of time for her when we're dealing with Maegor's reign, or maybe her specifically. Now, Rigo Draz is another one we talked about a little bit. He was Jaehaerys' master of coin. We talked about the savageness of his death and Jaehaerys' revenge on those people, or justice against those people. He's a good story that we'll tell another time. There's a lot of parallels between him and Illyrio. So that's interesting. We'll talk about him. Both of them kind of were lowborn that rose to be really powerful and rich and involved in politics, although Illyrio is a lot more involved in politics than Rigo was. So Illyrio, he's often referred to as a cheesemonger, which maybe gives us a clue to some of the food that's made there. I mean, Pentos isn't known for like luxury goods; it is known for trade, and we know we hear about all the farmlands and orchards around the area. So there may be a lot of food as part of the exports and import. Well, more exports than imports probably, but exporting some food, importing others. So I guess there's a lot of cheese made in Pentos. That makes sense. It's something that it wouldn't catch a lot of notice as an element in a big fantasy story, big fantasy epic, just production of food. But cheese is interesting because it's not a luxury good, yet it is a luxury good. Like fancy cheeses are luxury goods, but there's also your day-to-day cheeses that just like even the poorest people will have access to.
It's cheese certainly isn't exclusive to Italy, much less Genoa, but there are a lot of Italian cheeses, mozzarella and Parmesan and so on. And I wonder if that could be easily another parallel.
Yeah. So Illyrio, his wealth, remember, got him to the level where, wealth speaks in Pentos. The wealthiest have the most power there. He was able to marry the daughter of a cousin of the Prince of Pentos. But when he took Sarah as a lover, who, of course, we've had a lot to say about her, the probable Blackfire, the palaces of the prince was closed to him. They saw that as an insult. So there's definitely still a lot of elitism in Pentos, even though it's not rooted in Valyrian heritage. Plague killed Sarah. Remember, we mentioned the Great Spring Sickness most likely affected Pentos back in 209. Of course, Sarah didn't die in 209. She died probably more like in the 260s or 270s. And just a reminder that as a trade port, it's going to be very susceptible to plagues because of, just the nature of the way diseases spread. And, you're bringing it on a ship and lots of people. That can go quickly.
At one point, half the population of Genoa was killed to the Black Plague.
Oof. Damn. Pentos. What? Nasty.
It's just hard to comprehend numbers like
half
that.
Of a city. Jeez. So Pentos also allows for the collecting of exiles. Illyrio is a collector of obscure and unsavory things, Tyrion says. One of those that he doesn't specifically mention is exiles. He collects exiles. He collected John Connington. He collected the Golden Company, sort of. He collected this Dany and Viserys. And by being so close to King's Landing, enables a lot of that. Like, he's the first stop for a lot of exiles. Allows him to kind of snatch them right up or arrange for them to be brought to him, like Tyrion, right? He actually planned on bringing Aegon Young Griff, and Dany together for a marriage at Pentos, which would have been a really interesting like do-over of her married to Drogo. That's kind of what, in Lyra's mind, that's kind of what they're doing there. But that isn't going to happen. But of course, we still expect things to happen in Pentos. It just won't be a marriage of Aegon and Dany, I don't think. Especially because Aegon's already in Westeros. As we said before, Tyrion's Pentoshi name was Yolo. We mentioned Grolio very briefly.
YOLO, you mean?
Yeah, YOLO. Yeah, YOLO. Grolio is Pentoshi, the poor admiral that sailed those ships over to meet Dany and Karth and pick her up with Arstan, a.k.a. Barristan. Grolio was executed by the Myronese or the Yunkish, the Myronese and Yunkish, over the death of Yezenzo Yurkaz, or whatever that guy's name is, the dude who was trampled at the gladiatorial games at the reopening of the pits when Drogon showed up. So, poor guy. His arc is nothing but sadness. First Dany makes him go to Meereen and Astapor. Actually, first Astapor to buy the Unsullied, then takes apart his ships to build battering rams, and he's very bitter about that. And then she's perplexed by them wanting him as a hostage because he's kind of a nobody. Like, why? What's his value? And then he has a wife and kids back home, so he's valuable to them, but like he has no political value. And then they execute him, which is part of why they do that. They're like, well, they're not going to start anything over this guy's death, but it shows we can kind of push the envelope a little bit and exercise our authority and kind of move towards executing the dragons, which is what they really wanted. It was the year 262 when the tattered prince, aged 23, had his choosing to be the Prince of Pentos. The one who had just been beheaded, he's like, I don't want that fate, and he doesn't want to be beholden to the magistrate, the magisters, the nobility, the 40 families, and this, I'm not going to be your sacrificial lamb, y'all. He was not the first to notice this obvious thing, this obvious potential, and not the first to leave rather than accept. But he is the most recent. Both A Song of Ice and Fire, I think Dick Straw, or one of the members of the Windblown tells this story, The World of Ice and Fire also says the same line. It says he fled never to return. I don't know about never to return, you know. He hasn't returned yet, but I don't know, I wouldn't say never. I think he's coming back. Nina says, the Tattered Prince is very much not a nice person. And I think what he wants is to move Pentos to the opposite extreme from what it is now. Instead of a system where the collective council of magisters can murder the executive at their whim, the Tattered Prince wants a system where he can murder the magisters at his whim. This would not be Pentos on Pentos' terms. This would be Pentos on the Tattered Prince's terms. His personal domain where he can rule as an absolute authority or executive. I totally agree with that. I think Nina nailed it, and we might get that for a short term, or we may find... Yeah, I mean, Dany doesn't want that, but Barristan has already agreed to it. And then... what is she going to be stuck with that when she returns? Will Barristan even still be alive when she returns? So there's a lot of ways for this to go that are very unpredictable, and I like that a lot. I mean, some things we can predict about this series, but some things it's really hard to say.
Also, how much room is there for negotiation on the part of the Tattered Prince, both in word and in practice? Like if he makes this move and Barristan okayed it, but he's not there, and Dany comes back, she might be like, okay, fine, as long as you do X, Y, Z. Like, as long as there's no slavery.
Imposes additional conditions or whatever.
Yeah. Right. And he's like, okay, sure, fine. Yeah, I get to be the king of the city, and I just don't. And then he can also just not do the things he said he was going to do after the fact when she goes off to another continent or whatever.
If she's embroiled against the others in winter and the other kings and queens of Westeros, the Prince of the Tattered Prince might be like, I don't know if she's coming out of this. I can just do what I want. I can do what I want. And pay the consequences later. Say, oh, I'm sorry. Let me pay you off. Pay her off like the Dothraki get paid off.
Yeah.
I don't know if that'd be enough for her, but she also probably won't survive everything in order to come back and punish him. So, but it could be an interesting footnote in, the Dream of Spring as we hear about what's happening in the various states of affairs of various parts of the world. Pentos will likely be included in that. Do y'all remember the ship the Slow-Eyed made? The very sad tale of a ship that went all the way to Karth and was sunk by the false lights among the sisters. The Lord Godric Borel jokes about how he got pepper off a Slow-Eyed maid, and he's laughing about it, and Davos is like enjoying the pepper and like, you asshole. You sank this ship. He thinks how horrible it is to go all the way. He's like, the Slow-Eyed Maid went all the way to the Jade Sea and back and was almost home before lured to its death by these false lights. But the Slow-Eyed Maid is the source of the rumors about Dany. It brought back the tales of Dany and her dragons to Pentos. And the ship, the Slow-Eyed Maid's executive officer spoke with another dude that Davos then spoke with or overheard in this tavern. So, yes.
I prefer pepper to rumors. Just me.
Yeah, same. One of the galleys that was seized for the Hardhome campaign, remember Jon had a bunch of galleys just taken, like, nope, any ships currently at the East Watches Harbor, or we're going to use them for the rescue mission. One of them was the Pentoshi galley. So that ship may have been sunk. It's one of the ones that may have been sunk, so we don't know if it's going to get out. But if it does get out, it'll go back to Pentos and spread tales about what's happening beyond the wall, which is maybe the vector for the wider world to learn about the invasion of Mance and or the actual others and giants and things like that. Like, people outside of Westeros are going to hear about giants and zombie or whites. You make me call them zombies, Sean. It's your fault. whites and others and stuff like that. Like, that's a really interesting possibility. Just thinking of Pentos as just a vector for news. Again, it being the center of trade means it's also the center for news and rumors to spread, or a center, not the center. But so that's really interesting. Like, this could spread this a way for the wider world to learn about that vector of information, very much likely to pass through Pentos. As I said before, Penny and her family probably aren't from Pentos, but they were hired for the Purple Wedding there. And you would go there to hire performers, possibly, because that's a place known for performers. So, yeah. And the Karthine Warlocks, they didn't know where Dany went or where she was going to go after leaving Karth, but they were going to look in Pentos first. That's where they were going to head first. Instead, they found Euron, or Euron found them. Semantics. They whatever you want to put it, they wish that hadn't happened that way. They probably wish they had stayed home. Yeah, well, karma, brutal karma. Maybe a little too much, but they went looking for trouble. They found it.
Maybe it'll come back on Euron.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I don't expect Euron to have a happy ending. As I've said on the show before, when several of us attended a signing by George R. R. Martin, when I've handed him a copy of the map you see behind you, the known world map in particular, he remarked on how nice the map was, because of course, it's a Michael Clarfeld. Of course it's nice. Yeah. He said, and soon it will all be on fire. And I was like, what? Spoiler! I yelled and laughed. Surely he didn't mean all the cities of Essos would be in flames, although I guess it's possible. But I do think it's more likely he means a lot of them will go that way. Dany passing that way, pretty high on that list for Pentos. Very possible. It's right up there with Volantis. Here's a conversation I want to draw your attention to. Quote.
Here it is. Mirri Mazdor betrayed me. I burned her for it.
Mirri Mazdor was in your power. In Pentos, you shall be in Illario's power. It is not the same. I know the Magister as well as you.
Well, Jorah, you were right when you said that at the time. But now, still right, but less so. Like, if you have your dragons and you're Unsullied and you're Dothraki, you could still be in Illyria's power, but he's in your power too. He can't just assassinate you, because if you die in his home, I mean, he would get blamed for that. The Dothraki would just come for him. That he can't do that without massive consequences. So I don't think he's going to do that. He would have to be very careful about how he turns on his so-called puppet, especially if Drogon's like right there too. and that's the statement. So yeah, Jorah said that at the beginning of A Storm of Swords. Not things are just so different, and she might even have the wind blown on her side, like with the Tattered Prince and all that. So yeah, it's just Jorah's statement is interesting and useful, but the situation has changed a lot since then.
It is worth noting, though, that Mirri Mazdor was less of a significant person in the political structure.
That's
right?
True too, yes.
There wasn't some retribution for her killing Mirri Mazdor. For Illyrio, there might be, whether it's as simple as like the influence he could have wielded to help her. Now he's not there to do that.
That's
or
true.
people who were allied with him who now want to work against Dany, even if they can't necessarily stand up and defeat her dragons, they still might behind the scenes sink our ships or tell, spread false rumors or whatever else.
Just work against her when they could be working for her.
She has more to lose killing Illyrio than she did killing Mirri Mazdor.
That's true. Yeah, that's true.
That part, Jorah is correct on.
Yeah, if the castle of Harrenhal can burn, perhaps the brick walls of Pentos can as well. That's one potential fate for it. Or if she doesn't want to send her dragons against it, again, Unsullied, Dothraki, sellswords, plenty of options. And they don't have an army at all, so they would probably just give up. I don't know that it would. That's one reason I'm not sure it would come to outright devastation for Pentos. Even like I said, even their naval defenses would go from stout to pretty useless, even though they only have 20 ships, again, protecting the inlet. Maybe they could do that, but not with a dragon or 3 in play. So a number of the details about Pentos do paint it as rich but weak. The Dothraki make the Pentoshi nervous. That's in Dany's very first chapter. That might be a little bit of a low-key foreshadowing. However, they're not a slave city at the moment, so you can't expect them to just rise up like Volantis would, the way the Widow of the Waterfront says they will. But maybe they will. Maybe they understand their situation. Maybe they say, yeah, we're basically slaves. I don't know. Maybe it's kind of interesting. The semantics, the dichotomy, the small differences may amount to be large differences, depending on how things play out. I mean, even Illyrio even has Unsullied guards. Like, those are slaves, right? Like, it's so blatant, right? And here's another quote.
Maybe they were purchased and then freed.
Yeah,
maybe.
like how Dany freed hers, and they just opted to stay with her and fight with her because they don't know any other life. Like, all we're good at is fighting. Like, this seems like a good place to be. But here's another quote from Tyrion.
Slavery may be forbidden by the laws of Pentos, yet you have a finger in that trade as well, and maybe a whole hand. And yet you conspire for the Dragon Queen and not against her. Why? What do you hope to gain from Queen Daenerys?
He says he just wants to be master of coin, but I just do not believe that for a second. Tyrion doesn't either. Like, the dude is so rich. Like, I just don't, like, why? What would that do for him? More wealth? He doesn't even want to. He points out he doesn't want Castle Rock. Like, Viserys promised him Castle Rock, and he's like, I like my mansion better. I don't want to live in Castle Rock. You know, he doesn't even sound like he wants to go to Westeros, you know? So it is.
What do you think he actually does want?
I don't know. I mean, it could be like a Littlefinger thing where he just wants as much power as he can have, like the greed. Like the guy's persona exudes greed and excess, right? Like he is massively overweight and all that. And
I kind of agree, but I still think that like being master of coin is about the most power he could have.
Perhaps ruling behind the throne as well. Yeah, I mean, he might want that, but I don't know if that's his ultimate goal. I think he would be fine to be that, but I don't know if that's what he's doing all this for, just to be master of coin for Westeros. Like, it seems like very convoluted. So maybe there is some truth in him wanting to see the son of Sarah on the throne.
Yeah, I think it makes more sense for it to be personal at the level of high power he has. But on like my counterpoint to that is that I just can't ever relate to these like power hungry people where like I can't help but think like, okay, like you're very successful. Why are you still grasping for more? Yet across the board, like people do it. They do keep grasping for more, even though you're like, well, you should be satisfied. You have so much power.
Yeah.
I don't know. Sometimes they're just an ambitious person. Like I don't know.
A lot definitely depends on what transpires between Dany and Illyrio. If Illyrio can worm his way out of the things Dany's going to figure out, okay, so let's piece some of this together. Nina's got some good points on this as well. Dany's aware Illyrio's basically using slaves, but she also sees him as a friend and as a benefactor, so maybe she's willing to let that slide. Maybe she's going to come and be like, okay, you have to let your slaves go, though. Like, I can't have my supporters owning slaves. I'm the breaker of chains. Like, that just doesn't align, plus it's wrong. Illyrio might be just willing to just do whatever she says because he knows what's at stake, and she'll just burn him otherwise. She's given those vibes off. Like, yeah, I will kill you if you are a slaver. So it's tricky to see which way she'll go on that. But as we've also expressed, let me read Nina's point here. How long will that trust maintain? It might be kind of flimsy. Dany may, once more things come to light, she may change her opinion on Illyrio very, very dramatically. Because Tyrion knows something pretty critical about Illyrio that Dany doesn't, namely that Illyrio's plan for the better part of 2 decades was to install Aegon, not Dany or her brother. That she was originally part of the setup. She was the distraction. She was fodder, cannon fodder, basically. And Illyrio didn't intend for Dany to survive. So that only changed when she hatched dragons. Then they pivoted their plan. We're like, oh, wait, this is a totally unexpected result. We should absolutely include the dragons in our plan now that they exist again. Like, whoa. Couldn't have possibly accounted for that possibility. And so it sounds like Illyrio cares more about this Aegon person who might be his son. Tyrion might point that out as well if he figures that out fully. So yeah, Dany might come to realize that so much of this is different. She still might want to use Illyrio and feel like, well, we still need him. Like you said, Sean, like she's even finding these things out might mean, okay, I don't trust him anymore, but we still need him, and my greater goals are more important than solving Pentos's issues. I mean, she might become kind of jaded with that after the difficulties in Meereen. It's another or she might just be all more aggressive about it. You know, like it's just so hard to figure. There's so many possibilities.
Depending how it goes, she might trust him more. If she learns this stuff about him, understands his motivations, he levels with her about it all, it may be a greater level of trust.
He is convincing. Yeah, I mean, and don't forget Varys' involvement in all this. Like, Illyrio could point out, well, look, my guy over there, if you lose me, you lose him. And you really want him
and
on
the
your
network
side.
of spies that goes along with it. And also, it's not like there's no way to make money without slaves, right? Illyrio might be happy to shed the slaves because he's, especially the capital and position he has already, he can continue being successful and wealthy. So yeah, Dany, you want to get rid of slaves? I'll spearhead that. for you. He might be very genuine about it, and
genuinely, yeah, because he needs to do it to get for his greater goals to be accomplished. Yeah, and you're right. To him, it might be a lot of work, but it might not cost him anything. He might still come out ahead or break even, or as long as the end
even if
result
it costs
is
him
profit.
a lot. Like if you have like $25 million instead of $30 million, that cost me $5 million. Yeah, but I still have $25 million. I'll be okay. This is gonna. My bigger goals or my alliance with Dany or whatever else can move forward.
In Illyria's case, we'd probably be more appropriate using billion than million, but yeah, your point is still well taken. And also, on top of everything, Tyrion knows or has sussed out the truth that Aegon's not the son of Rhaegar. Is Illyria going to try to sell that lie to Dany too? Because will he try to sell the lie if he figures that Tyrion has figured out that lie? Like, is another thing, is Illyria going to be like, oh, I think Tyrion's probably figured out that this isn't really Rhaegar's son, so I won't tell that lie. But maybe he'll try to convince Dany to tell that lie because it's important to tell Westeros that lie.
Right. It's another way he might actually win more trust from Dany by telling the truth about that lie. And she may also understand the value of that lie.
But ultimately, I think she won't accept it because she's, in her vision, the slayer of lies. The cloth dragon, Mummer's dragon on poles is almost certainly Aegon. And if she's the slayer of that lie, that foreshadows her ending this whole thing, this charade, not going along with it. But maybe she has to go along with it for a little while. Maybe she doesn't just immediately try to torch it. Maybe she doesn't. Yeah. Maybe he does. Maybe she doesn't believe Tyrion at first. I don't know. Or she's like, well, what is this little dude trying to sell me a lie for? Maybe he's just trying to get Cashley Rock. Like, Tyrion's awfully convincing though, but so is Illyria. So this could get interesting.
it would be an interesting dilemma if there was a marriage arranged and it got all this support behind it, and then she discovered now that all the plans are built around this. Oh wait, he's not really who he said he was, or who he thought he was. But all the alliances and plans and stability are all built around it. Does she now shed it? Can it survive even with the truth coming out? Maybe it's enough for her to just have this marriage and his support stays